下の太刀西残日極意
Welcome to a new Houdini course. In this course we are going to learn all about controlling particle and smoke simulations. We'll start off by splicing together multiple particle simulations that we can use as a pyro source. Using the smoke simulation we can advect particles to get a unique magical look. I'll also show you a quick and easy setup to create embers and also a firewall that serves as a background layer. In the comp section we will bring all of our renders together. We'll go over best practices and some of my favorite nodes and workflows that I use on a daily basis. So I hope you will enjoy this course and let's get started. Welcome to a new Houdini course. We are going to start as we usually do by doing a quick overview over the entire project. So here I am inside of Nuke with the final result, and we are going to create a couple of layers here. So we have the fire in the back, we have the main effect, so the aura itself, and then we also have a separate layer for the embers that are in front. So let's take a look at these layers. So this will be the entire comp in Nuke, so it's not going to be anything too complicated. We will start by bringing in the background, so we will also create this in Houdini. This is just a simple firewall, and we really only need this to have something subtle in the back. We don't want this to take too much of the main aura effect. So after we do some adjustments here, we end up with this, which is a very subtle layer, as we can see. Now the main layer is going to be the aura layer itself, so this will be the fire and our character, and we can see that this is what we start with and this is what we end up with. So we are going to do quite a bit of changes here to achieve this look. First we are going to split up the character in all of the respective AOVs. So if I disable any of these shuffle nodes, we can see that all of these give us individual control over certain channels. So we have control over the GI, the subsurface scattering, the specular, and all of that. And after we split all of these up and put them together, we will put our character on top of our fire. And then from the same render we also have a costume pass that we are going to create inside of Houdini. So this is using a Fresnel shader, which we will use to create certain effects and masks to highlight certain parts of our character, like so. And then on top of this we are going to finally bring the emission layer from our main render. So this is the emission, so only our particles, and we are going to add some motion blur to this and do some color adjustments so we can place this on top of our comp, and then we can add some glow. And here we have our embers, so we will also create this layer inside of Houdini. We will add this on top, and then using our original firewall render, so this render here, we can use this as a distortion map to help us achieve that heat wave effect. So if I disable this, we can see that we distort our character, and then we also use the same layer to blur our entire image on top of the distortion. So here we can see that when I turn this on and off, we also have this blurring here, which again helps us to sell this heat wave effect. Finally we have some post-processing effects, and we end up with the final result over here. And so this will be our Nuke comp. As we can see, this is not super complicated. If you're familiar with some of my other courses, you can tell that this entire comp here is pretty much lightweight to what we normally do. So this will be the layers that we want to create. And if you want to follow along with the Nuke part as well, all of these render layers will be provided to you if you follow the link in the description. And this is in case you don't want to spend time rendering the layers after you've assembled them in Houdini. You can go ahead and just use mine instead. So now if we go in Houdini, most of our work will be to create the particles on our character, and this is the result that we end up with. Now unfortunately this doesn't look very good in the viewport, but when we render this we are going to get this result. So let's go back and examine this scene for a bit. We will start from the beginning over here on the left, and also this project file is available to download, so check the link in the description. We are going to start with our character. Now, unfortunately, I can't share the exact same character that I used inside this render because this isn't mine. I bought this character on Sketchfab, and I will provide a link in the description if you want to use this character as well. But this effect can work with any character, so in our case we are just going to use the test geometry Tommy model. So we have our character and we are going to scale him up a bit so we work with larger units, and this will enable us to control our fire a little bit better. So the default scale, if we take a look, so if I disable this transform node and go in one of the front views, we can see that we are working roughly with a 2 unit size, and in general this is a little bit too small for fire simulations. So this is why I scaled him up a bit, so we are working roughly within the 0 to 5 range. So we are scaling him up by a uniform scale of 3. So essentially this entire effect can be split into 3 phases, and in the first phase over here we are going to create a bunch of particle simulations. So we see here that we have a bunch of pop nets. We have 4 in fact, so if I look at these one by one, here we can see one of them, and this will be another one for the entire body, and again another one for the entire body as well. And then we also have this one over here which controls sort of the lateral spreading of our effect, like this. And we are going to create all of these individual pop nets, and then we are going to splice them together into one single simulation. So this way we will have unlimited control, and we can use this simulation as a base for our fire. And for example here, if I also wanted to have this sort of lateral spreading here on the legs as well, I would be able to simply create another pop simulation and merge it with the rest of our simulations. So this is how we can control the effect. So we are going to use the result of this simulation. Here is the cached result, and this will be a base and also a velocity field for a pyro simulation. So we can see here that I have an object merge which basically points to the result of our combined pop nets, and one is for the density, the other one is going to be for the velocity. And then we have a couple of extra fields over here. This will be an SDF, and this is another velocity field that will help us art direct our smoke further when we do the simulation. So in this Pyro solver, if I go to the sourcing tab, we see that we have the density, we have our velocity, so these two, and then we also have a divergence field which is going to be this one over here. So all of these sources combined will really help us to achieve a very customized movement for the smoke, and we are going to end up with this simulation. And then this simulation we are going to use to advect particles. So again we are going to do a pop net, and we are going to start from the same geometry as a source, and we are bringing in some helper geometry that will allow us to further control the movement of the simulation. So the cached result will look something like this. And this is the final result that we end up with. And after the simulation we can adjust the colors, and then we can do further modifications, and we are going to scale it back to the original size of our mesh. So basically it's going to be 3 times smaller. And here I have a couple of extra nodes that will control the P scale, and we are also going to use a retime to speed up the simulation. So we are going to simulate all of the phases sort of in real time, so a bit slower, and we are going to cache a bunch of frames. So we can see here that I cached 500 frames for this, just so we can speed it up. So we are going to make our particles go 2.5 times faster than the regular version. So this will help sell the intensity and the power of this effect. So this was just a quick overview, and we will recreate everything from scratch with the next lesson. Before we get started with building the actual project, I want to do a quick demonstration on some of the techniques that we are going to be using. So this is mostly in relation to the lateral spread of the fire. So we can see where the fire here converges into one point on the side. In order to create this very specific movement, we are going to use several methods, but the one that I want to showcase is how to leverage the power of SDFs to art direct particle and smoke. So let me just drop down a grid, and what I'm gonna do in this lesson will not be directly connected to the project itself. I just want to demonstrate this technique so you don't have to follow along. Let's go ahead and drop a scatter. I will randomize the global seed for frames, so I will set the global C to be $FF, and relax iteration turned off. Let's increase the count, and then I can drop this inside a popnet. Let's step inside and let's go to the source. I will disable the guide and let's use all points for emission type. And also we don't have to make our particles last forever, so let's just set the life expectancy maybe to a value of 3. So now we are basically just spawning a bunch of points, and let's go up. Let's create a simple sphere, and I will template the popnet with E, and let's preview this sphere. Let's press enter, and I'll just move this up a little bit, and I'll increase the uniform size. So I'll do something like this, and let's turn this into an SDF. So let's drop this inside a VDB from polygons, and I want to use distance VDB, so SDF, and probably we can reduce the voxel size. Let's use 0.3. So we know that the SDF stores a distance value to the surface. So we have a bunch of voxels, and I can even use a VDB visualize 3. And let's maybe go ahead and reduce the voxel size so we get a more accurate display of our voxels. Let's do something like 0.05, and I will template this and go to the SDF. So all of these voxels simply contain a value that's basically saying how far apart it is from the surface, and if it's outside it's going to be positive values, and if it's inside it's going to be negative values. Now using these values we can compute a gradient, so a vector that points in the direction of the increasing value. So if we compute a gradient volume from this SDF, we are essentially going to create a velocity field that's going outwards from the center of our sphere. And for example, after this VDB from polygons, let's do a VDB analysis, and by default this will grab our only volume that we have, so the surface, and we see that now it is a vector3 volume. So previously over here we have a float volume, so the voxels only stored a float value, so the distance, and then using this value we can now store a vector that points in the direction of this increasing value. And to visualize this as a velocity field, let's do a volume slice, and let's also do a volume trail, and let's plug these, and let's get rid of this VDB visualize 3, and we can see that this is our volume that we create. And we can also see that we only get a border of our sphere, and this is because when we create the SDF, it is going to use the exterior and interior band voxels. So if I increase this, I expand the borders of this volume. Now what we want here is to fill the interior so it reaches all the way to the center, and we can see now that we end up with this velocity vector that points outwards from the center of our sphere. And now if I grab the sphere and I change its shape, so if I increase its height and do something like this, our velocity field will update to point to the center of the object. So we can use this velocity field to help guide our particles exactly into the spots that we want. And I'll get rid of all of these nodes and only leave the VDB from polygons, and let's also set the radius back here to 0.5 on all directions. So let's go ahead and plug this as the second input in my popnet. Let's go inside here and let's drop a geometry VOP, and to use the SDF, let's go to inputs here and set the second input. Let's point to our second context geometry. So now from inside this VOP node, let's go ahead and from op input 2 we can do a volume gradient, and we will sample this from our current position. So I'll plug the P inside the sample pause, and this volume gradient will automatically compute this gradient field that we created with the VDB analysis node. So we can do this directly inside the VOPs. So now the result of this will be this vector that points from the center of our sphere, and if I plug this result inside the velocity and press play, we see that the points are moving away from our sphere, and this is because the values of the sphere are increasing from the inside of our sphere. So it goes from negative to positive outside. We can simply reverse this vector direction if we do a negate here, or if I multiply this with a -1, which is essentially what the negate will do. So now, since we inverted the direction, we end up with this result. So the points, we can see that they are pointing right in the center of our sphere. And for example, if I go up and I look at my sphere, we can see how this works. So this is right at the center of our sphere. And if I grab this sphere and move this around, let's go ahead and reset our simulation. We see now how all of the particles point to this new updated position. So we can tell the points exactly where we want them to go, and we can also determine the radius of this effect by simply increasing the sphere. So this is is the power of SDFs. We don't have to use pop attract or any other pop forces and stuff like that. So this is the technique that will help us guide the particles. And when it comes to volumes, we can do something a little bit similar. Let's go ahead and drop a test geometry rubber toy, and I'll scale this up, and I'll go ahead and let's create smoke from this. So let's do VDB from polygons, and let's use fog density. And we can use the same SDF that we created here, so the sphere. I will just copy this over. Let's go ahead, and I want to merge these because I want to source them both in the same Pyro solver. So I'll go ahead, and from here I'll do a Pyro solver. And for our sourcing, let's go ahead and get rid of everything inside, everything except the density. And we have this SDF which stores again the distance values, so it's going to be the surface volume. Let's go ahead and source this in. So I will hit plus, and source volume will be surface. And if I source this into our divergence field, so let's use divergence here. Now our smoke will be sucked towards the center of our sphere. So normally divergence makes our smoke expand. So just real quick, I will disable this second source. Let's go ahead and use the density as our divergence. So with the default settings and a source scale of 1, if I hit play now, it's going to take our source density and it's going to expand the smoke based on that density. So if I increase this source scale here to 10, then the smoke will be expanding even further. And this is really the base of explosions by using this divergence. So I'll go ahead and remove this, and let's turn our divergence back that's based on our SDF. Since the SDF will have negative values by default when it's inside our sphere, when I press play, we can see that it's starting to suck up the smoke to the center of the sphere. So I can also template this sphere, and I can see that if I move this around and I reset the simulation, now the smoke will be sucked towards the center over here. So this is the effect that we get. So it's pulling our smoke towards the center, and it's also contracting the smoke as well. So we are losing the volume actually. And this is the key ingredient to get this tapered look. So if I look at the final effect here, what we see here is not what normally happens in a pyro simulation, because the default behavior of the smoke is to maintain and preserve the volume as much as possible. So if we are not using this divergence streak to contract the smoke here in certain areas, we can't really get this tapered look on our simulation. So this is how we are going to use SDFs, and they're going to be a big part on creating this effect. And now we can go ahead, and with the next lesson we can actually start building the project. So let's go ahead and get started, and I will create a geometry container. Let's rename this to fx_main, and let's step inside and drop our Tommy test geometries. So this effect will work with any kind of model. You just have to make sure that the model that you're using is a watertight mesh. So in order to ensure this, for the resolution option here for Tommy, we will use low resolution, and this will get rid of the extra elements like loading and stuff like that we don't really need. So from here, because this gives us quite a low resolution mesh, let's just do a remesh, and I will set the target size to maybe 0.015, and this should be enough. And for example, if I duplicate this, and let's say that the model that you're using doesn't have this option to do a low res version, so you would have a model with clothing and a lot of other extra items that you don't need, I would recommend that you just press S and select your model and just get rid of everything that's not necessary. And then from here we can close this off with a polycap, so this will turn it into a watertight mesh. And then you can either do a remesh from here or do a VDB convert and turn it into an SDF and then convert it back to geometry. So whatever the case may be, you need to make sure that it doesn't have any holes, just so we can create volumes and we can emit particles properly from the model. So like I mentioned in the overview, we will need to increase the size of this model quite a bit. So if I go in the front view by pressing spacebar 3, Tommy will be between 0 and 2 units on the y-axis, and this isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but I find it that pyro simulations are a lot easier to control if you are working with at least, I would say, 5 units. So what we can do from here is just drop down a transform, and I will increase the uniform scale to a value of 3. So now Tommy has a height roughly to around 5. And like I said, this will just allow us to better control the Pyro simulation. And then when we create a simulation, we will just have to reduce it by a factor of 3. So we will just simply do 1 multiplied by 3. All right, so let's undo this and let's set this uniform scale back to 3. And now we can start creating our particle sources. We will create a different particle source for each simulation that we will do, and we will do 4 simulations and splice them together. And we will start with just a simple simulation that has a pop wind at its core. So let's go ahead and let's just do a null here, so we keep things organized, and this will be our geo as our C, so our geometry source, and we can start creating our sources. So let's do a scatter, and we are going to use scatter for each of these sources. Let's turn off relax iterations, and I will just increase the force total count. I'm pretty much just eyeballing this value here. We just need enough points here so that we can create interesting sources and assign some cool noise values to these points. So maybe 40k in this case will be fine. We can always come back and adjust this later. So let's do an attribute VOP from here, and let's create some noise. So let's rename this to add noise, and let's step inside, and we can use many different noises. We can use a turbulent noise, but let's in this case use an anti-aliased flow noise. So I will type here AA flow noise, and let's drop this down. Let's use for signature, let's use for the input 1D noise, because we want to evolve this noise, so we want to animate this. From our position, we will do a vector to vector 4, and then we will plug the time as our 4th component here, and let's plug the result in our position, and then the noise result, let's do a fit range here, so we have further control, and we will plug this into the CD. And now to keep things simple, let's go ahead and right click and choose to promote all inputs for our noise and also for our fit. So let's create input parameters. Now I can go up, let's make some room here, and let's just increase the frequency and create a more interesting pattern. And now we can use the minimum and maximum source values here for our noise. So I might want to, I think these default values are pretty alright as they are. Let's take a look at the animation. Alright, and we can adjust the speed of this animation if I change this 4th component here in the frequency. So if I want to make this slower, I can reduce this value here, and this will work. We probably need something a little bit fast, so maybe the value that was earlier was fine. So let's just use a value of 2, and because this will be kind of a chaotic simulation, so having a higher speed will help us. Alright, let's also add a rest attribute so we can further control our particles after they've been simulated. And now from here we want to get rid of all of the points that are completely black. So if I press D and I change the background to the light display, we can see that we have a lot of these dark points. Let's go ahead and maybe switch this displayed particles to points. So we only want to spawn particles if they have a little bit of whiteness in them. So let's press D and let's go back to our dark display. And from here I will do a blast node. We will set the group type to points, and let's set an expression here at CD bigger than 0. And let's delete non-selected. So now if I turn on the point display, we can see that if I turn this blast node on and off, we get rid of a lot of points. So we only want to simulate again just the points that have a color value bigger than 0, so they're not completely black. And if I place this inside a popnet, let's go ahead and step inside and set up our DOPs. And for our pop source, let's set the emission time to all points, and let's disable guides. And here we will just do a simple pop wind. Let's go ahead and let's just give this a little bit of amplitude, maybe a value of 1. Let's press play and see what we get. Okay, so already this is pretty decent. We might want to reduce the pulse length, so this will make our noise that's driving this pop wind animate a little faster. So I will set the pulse length to 0.5. I will maybe decrease the swirl size as well. Let's maybe use 0.45. Let's leave the amplitude at 1. Let's also switch this back to pixel display. And also we want these particles to last only a little bit. So in our pop sources, let's go to birth tab. Let's set the life expectancy. Let's let's maybe start with 0.6 and also introduce a little bit of live variance. Let's maybe do 0.25. These are completely arbitrary, it's just to give us a starting point. So let's check the simulation now, and this is pretty much what we want in terms of this first simulation, I believe. And if, for example, I want this layer of simulation to advect our fire even further, I could just simply increase the life for our particle. So if I do a value of 2 here, then each particle, because it lasts longer, it has more time to advect our smoke when we do the pyro simulation. But because we only want this to give our particles just a slight initial noise, we don't really need them to last for a long time, so we actually want them to be rather short in life duration. So let's set the life expectancy back to 0.6. Okay, and let's press play. So I think this will be fine. We can always go back and adjust our settings here, and I will encourage you to play around with some of these live settings and maybe also some of these pop wind settings as well. One final thing that we have to do here, whenever we want to use our own scatter as a particle source inside a pop net, as we did here. So if I go up, we scatter the points ourselves. If we use this in a pop net, we have to randomize this global seed value per frame. So inside the expression for the global seed here, let's do $FF, and now every frame we will get a new seed. And in our pop net, this will now fill up our geometry a lot better. Probably this is not super noticeable in this case, but this $FF expression we always want to use when we are using the scattered points inside a popnet. So that's just something to keep in mind. So this will be good for our first layer of simulation, and let's go ahead and take care of our second layer. For the second layer, we want particles that flow vertically along our mesh. So we basically want the particles to fly upwards in the Y direction, but we also want them to retain the shape of our mesh, sort of like they're flowing along the character. And we don't really need to change the source an awful lot for this. So what I can do is I can simply grab all of these nodes except the popnet, and I will press Ctrl C and just paste them over here and start off with pretty much the same source. What we can do here for the noise is we can just simply change the offset just so we get a different noise pattern, so they're a little bit different than the previous source. So we always want to introduce variation where we can. Let's go back here to our second source. I might also want to play around with the frequency of this noise as well. Let's go ahead and let's just increase this even more. So let's do something like this. Let's press play. Let's maybe reduce the frequency of the time, so our fourth dimension here, make them slightly slower, and this will be fine. So I want the particles to fly upwards, but I also want them to fly a little bit inside towards the center of the character. So the easiest way to achieve this is if I simply create a point from where to base this vector that I'm looking for. And if I drop down and add to create this point, let's hit this plus to create the point, and I will press enter in the viewport, and I'll just bring this up and I can go to the geosource. Let's grab this and press E to template. Let's go back to our point. So I want all of these points to look at this point and create a vector based on this position. So now if I go back to the blast node, let's do an attribute VOP. Let's untemplate our geosource and go back here. Let's place the add in our second input so we can reference it inside. Let's rename this to set V for set velocity. Let's go inside. So from our op input 2, we can do an import point attribute, and the point number will be 0 because we only have one point, so we can create a constant and leave this at 0, point it to our ptnum, and this has to be an integer. And probably it would have been easier if I just middle mouse click and promote the ptnum to a constant. So it's pretty much the same thing. And with this import point attribute, this will look for the p as the default attribute, which is what we want. Now we can do a subtract from our own position, and we will place the position of our point from outside as our second input in this subtract, and I can visualize this vector. If I place this inside the normal, if I turn on the normal display, this will be the vectors, and we can see that the vectors are pointing in the right direction, but they're going away from the point, so I want them to go towards our point here, and I will just reverse the order of this subtraction by pressing Shift R. And now we have the vector that we are looking for. And now to better control this vector, let's also do a normalize. So all of the vectors have a length unit scale of 1, and we are using the normal to visualize this vector, but really we want to export this to our velocity. So I'll plug the result in our V, and I can actually get rid of this normal connection here, and let's turn off the normal point display. I will go up, and if I place this inside a popnet, let's go ahead and use the same sourcing as the previous one that we created. So inside our dot network, for our pop source, again we will use all points for emission. Let's turn off guide, and because we already have this velocity attribute, if I play the simulation, our points should be moving towards our goal that we created here, so our single point. Let's go back. So we are getting what we are looking for so far. We also don't need these particles to last forever, so in the birth tab, let's go to life expectancy. Probably we need these particles to last around the same as our first layer. Let's maybe try a value of 1 and a live variance of 0.3, and let's see what this will give us. And I think this will be fine. Maybe we don't even need them to last this long. One other thing that we can do is we can actually randomize the speed of our particles. So I don't want to change their direction, I just want to randomize the length of this velocity vector a little bit. So let's go back up, and inside our set v attribute VOP, we can go ahead and generate a random value for each of our points. Let's just create a duplicate of our geometry VOP globals here by holding Alt and dragging. And from our ptnum, let's do a random, and we also want to fit this value. Let's say that from 0 to 1, which the random generates, let's use destination mean. Currently we have the destination mean set to 0, meaning that some particles aren't moving at all. Let's say that the minimum speed I want them to have will be, let's try maybe something like 0.35. Alright, so now the particles will vary in speed from 35% to 100% basically. And to apply this value, let's do a multiply after our normalize, and I will plug the fit result in our second multiply here. And now if I reset the simulation, we also have a bit of variation in the speed. So again, following the principle of always adding variation wherever we can. And on that note, we can go inside our .NET, and let's also add a pop wind here as well. Let's increase the amplitude, decrease the swirl size, and I will also decrease the pulse length. Let's take a look. Alright, so now it's starting to look a lot more interesting. And now we want to force our particles to stick to the geometry so they follow the shape of our character. And by having the particles follow the shape of the character, the effect itself will be a lot better integrated with our mesh. So whenever we can, we always want the particles to interact with the source object from where it comes from. And to do this, we can use an SDF, and we will go up and we will create this SDF from our geometry. Over here to the side, and maybe I'll make some room. So over here to the side, let's do a VDB from polygons, and we want to create this SDF, so we will leave this at distance VDB. Let's increase the resolution here so we get more accurate result. Let's use 0.01. Maybe we don't need this much accuracy. Let's use 0.02 instead. And now, in order for our particles to not escape this SDF field, we can increase the band voxels here for both exterior and interior. And I like to use world space units here just so I get a better feel of how big our exterior band voxels are. And I think that a value of 0.25 for each of these should should be plenty of room. And from here I will do a null, and this will be our SDF. I will go ahead and grab this null and press Ctrl C to copy, and we want to go back in our popnet and let's do a geometry VOP here. And for our inputs, let's set our second input to be SOP, and let's point to our SDF that we created. And now if I go inside, we can access the SDF geometry from op input 2, and we want to use a volume sample and also a volume gradient. So let's drop this here, and we want to point the sample position to our P and also here as well for our volume sample. And these operations that we are going to do here, I go into a lot more detail in the volume sample and volume gradient video that I have available for free. So if you are not familiar with this technique, go ahead and check out that video. From our volume gradient, we want to do a normalize, and we will multiply it with our volume sample. So let's plug this here. If I grab the current position of our point, let's go ahead and plug this back in our P. If I do a subtract and I subtract this vector that we created here with our volume nodes, let's go ahead and plug this here. Now all of our points are sort of being forced on the surface of this geometry. And I found that this volume gradient and volume sample technique gives us the best results when we want to stick points to a surface, but in reality, we probably could have used a minimum position as well. So just as an example, if I go up and I go back here and I grab this geosource, and let's go back here and let's use input 3 to point to our source. If I were to do a minimum position, so if I drop this minimum position node here, plug the pose inside our P, I could just use this node instead to update the position. And as we can see, it almost works the same way. So if I play the simulation now, we do have pretty much the same result. The only problem here is that this sometimes creates a little bit of artifacts around the edges of the geometry. So this is a little bit hard to see because we're not working with a lot of points. But when we have millions of particles, this might be a problem. So usually when I do the sticking to geometry, I like to use the volume gradient and volume sample. So I'll plug this back into our position. So let's play the simulation, and I think this will be fine. We might want to just increase the pop wind strength to add a little bit more noise into this movement. So I will just increase the amplitude here. Let's try 1.25. So let's press play. I think this is maybe too much. Let's just use a value of 1. Okay, so this is pretty good, and this will be our second layer. So let's now go up. So we have the first layer, and then we have our second layer. Probably we could have done a file cache, but I will leave this as it is for now. Let's go ahead and rearrange these slightly, and I can start merging our layers. So I will grab this popnet, let's drop down a merge, and let's merge it with our second layer. Okay, so now we are starting to add up our particles. So we pretty much have this second layer that we created, which is the points sticking to the surface, which is kind of our main layer that's going to drive the movement. And on top of this, we also have these random spots that fly a little bit away from our geometry. So when we add up all of the layers together, we will have a general movement for our fire, but also a lot of variation as well, which will create a more believable result. So if I look at the merged result, this is a pretty good base. Now, of course, we'll still need to add the lateral spread of this fire, which is pretty much the selling point of this effect. But on top of that, when I analyze the effect in the anime itself, it seemed to me that aside from the lateral spread of the fire, there was also some fire right around the head area as well. So we can create a separate particle simulation only for that. And we can use the same source as we used earlier. So I will just go ahead and grab all of these nodes up until the blast. Let's Ctrl C and copy them over. And let's see how we can create the particles around the head. Let's go to our blast node result. And again, we want to randomize the pattern for this noise. So I will just increase the offset slightly. And for this, maybe I will increase the frequency even more. And I want to probably decrease the minimum value here, so I want to scatter slightly more points, maybe something like this. And let's press play to also check out the speed, and I think this will be fine. Maybe we can even increase the frequency even more. and let's set the speed to a value of 3. Okay, I think this will be fine. And for these particles, I only really want them to exist only in this area, so pretty much only from shoulder level and up, so I can do a clip from here and I will just get rid of all of the particles that we don't need. So if I press enter in the viewport, I will just grab this handle and bring it up right until where I want to delete all of the points that are not of use for us. So let's do something like this. And maybe I will turn on the point display so we can see this better. So we need to create a vector that points up and a little bit outwards as well, so to the sides. And we can pretty much use this same setup that we did earlier, where we set our velocity based on a point. So let's go ahead and grab this attribute VOP and add, and I will Control C and I will just paste them over here. Let's plug this here. So for this attribute VOP, I can maybe just create a visualizer for our velocity. So I will just click this V here, turn on my visualizer. Let's take a look at our V. Alright, so now we can see our velocity clearly. Now we simply have to grab this point that we created. I will press enter in the viewport and I will just bring this down, and I want the vectors to point away from this point. So inside our attribute VOP, I will reverse the order of this subtraction. So press Shift R and now we can see that they point away. Let's go up, let's go back to our point. And I can also bring this a little bit in front, so I want these particles to also move slightly back. So we can see how easy it is to art direct exactly the movement of our particles. And if I, for example, want them to spread out a little bit more, I can just drag this point up, and now we have even more spreading. So I will place this back down here, and I believe something like this should be okay. Alright, so I will turn off the visualizer and I will actually just duplicate this pop network. So I'll hold down Alt and drag this over, and inside our pop net, I don't want the particles to stick to the geometry. So I will step inside and I will just get rid of our geometry VOP that forces our particles to be on the surface of the geometry. And if I play the simulation, we almost get what we are looking for. Now the amplitude of this pop wind is a little bit too strong, so I will just reduce this to 0.2 and maybe also reduce the swirl size to 0.3. Let's go ahead and use a pixel display and let's play the simulation, and this is what we are looking for. Maybe let's say that I want more noise, so I will increase the amplitude. Alright, and something like this will be fine. Let's go ahead and also merge this layer in our main effect. So let's place this here and let's preview everything at the same time. Alright, looking pretty good. We might want to do some speed adjustments here and there, but let's go ahead and take care first of our final layer, which is the lateral spread. For the final layer, we can start with the same source that we started so far. So let's go ahead and grab all of these layers, so up until the blast, and do another copy of these over here to the side, and go to the blast node, and again we want to adjust the offset of our noise, and probably the frequency is fine as it is. And in order to achieve this lateral spreading movement, we can break it down in a few steps. First, we need to create a vector that points towards the goals that we want. So we're going to do kind of the same thing what we are doing over here with a point that we create that will help us guide our particles. Only in this case, since we need a point on each side, we actually need 2 points, and we need to change up this setup a little bit. Let's first go ahead and go back to our geometry, and I will template this node with E, and I will create another point here to the side. Let's create this, and let's go ahead and press enter in the viewport, and I want to place this over to the side where I want one of our spreading goals to be. And then from here we can simply do a copy and transform. And for the settings here, if I set the scale on the X direction here to -1, we are going to have a copy onto the other side. I probably also could have used a mirror, so if I do a mirror, the default settings should be fine. So let's actually just use a mirror instead, since this is essentially what we are doing. And we can adjust the handle here for our mirror, but since our character is exactly in the center of our scene, all of these default settings will be fine. So we just want to create the same point on the other side, and now if I go back and adjust this point, our second point will adjust as well. So this is what we want. Now earlier when we were just using one point, we could grab the position of that point by using the point number 0. But since we have 2 points now, we can no longer access it, giving it directly the point number. So instead we need to determine, based on our positions on our geometry, so our particles, based on their position, which of these points is closer, and retrieve that point number so we can then import that point attribute. So we can do this inside a popnet. Let's go ahead and drop down a popnet. And I will just go ahead, and we probably could have just copied one of the other popnets, but let's just go real quick and set the emission type here to all points, turn off the guide, and let's set the life expectancy. We want this to last longer, so we'll use a value of 3. Let's go ahead and drop a geometry node, and we want to grab our points from outside, so let's go ahead and from over here I might even do a null, and this will be our lateral goals. And let's go ahead and I will grab this, Control C, let's go back here, and inside our inputs let's access this from input 2 and point this to our SOP, our lateral goals. So now inside our geometry VOP, like we mentioned earlier, we want to grab the nearest point from our goal points geometry. So op input 2, let's do a near point, and we want to grab it based on our position. So let's plug our position inside the pos, and now this will retrieve the point number that's closest to our particle. So we can use this inside an import point attribute, and we can point the file to our second input. So like I said earlier, we need this near point now because we can set the ptnum directly to a value of 0. And now that we have the nearest point, we can create this vector that points towards our goals, and we can do a subtract from our p. Let's subtract the position of our points, and I think we have to reverse this vector, but let's just plug this inside the velocity and see what we get. So if I press play, it's going in the opposite way. So like I said, we need to reverse their orders with Shift R, and if I check the simulation now, we are kind of getting the movement that we are after. Of course, we still have to do some adjustments here, but we are on the way. Now, we don't really need to simulate the entire body mesh for this. So just like we did earlier with the other simulation layer, we can go ahead and remove all of the points that we don't need from our body mesh. So I'll go up, and what we can do to make this easier for us to select and also keep it fairly procedural, we can just drop down a sphere and we can use a copy to points and use our goals as the source point. So let's maybe arrange these nodes, and if I preview the result, now I can grab the sphere, and maybe we can also template our source points so we can see what we are doing here. And with this sphere, I'll press enter, and I can go ahead now and increase the uniform scale, and now we can use these spheres to just select the points that we are after. So I will just increase this size a little bit, and what we can do is we can just do a group after our blast. Let's set this to points, and let's plug our spheres in the second input, and we want to use keep in bounding regions, and let's use bounding object. So now I can do another blast node here. Let's set this to points, and let's select this group that we just created, and we will delete non-selected. So now I can grab the sphere, and if I increase or decrease the radius, we can grow or shrink our selection. So I think we are looking for something like this, and I can also play around with the individual radius scales here. So maybe I can do something like this, and I can lower this on the Y, and I think something like this will be fine. So if I go back to the result now, we have this, and already if I were to just place this in our merge node so we can preview it with all of the effects, we can see that this is the result that we get. Now we still need to fine-tune this final layer, but hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. So let's go back to this layer here, and the first thing that we notice is that there is this very ugly stepping in the movement of our particles, and this is that pesky stepping issue that you will keep running into when you are dealing with particles in Houdini. And I have a separate video dedicated specifically to how to fix various stepping issues, and there are a couple of routes that we can take here. We can either randomize the velocity per particle, or we can fade in the velocity using the age of our particles, which is what we are going to do. So let's go back inside and inside the geometry VOP. Let's go ahead and let's do a multiply after our subtract. So after we get our vector, we can do a multiply, and if I multiply this with age, so I'll grab the age and place this as our second value for the multiply. What happens now is that the particles will start with a speed of 0% and over a duration of 24 frames. So at 24 frames they reach 1 second, which means they will have 100% speed. So we can see now that we are slowly ramping up their speed, and we mostly get rid of that stepping effect. And the overall effect is a little bit more organic. Now I want to speed up this process of increasing the speed, so I want the particles to speed up faster, and I can use a fit range after our age. So let's drop a fit range here, and let's reduce the source max to maybe 0.4. So this will mean that roughly after 10 frames after a particle is born, it will go from a 0% speed to 100% speed. So it just ramps up a little bit faster. So if I preview the result now, we get the initial speed that we had earlier, and we get rid of the stepping. So this is the first component of creating this movement. Now I also want a tapered look, so I want this effect to have on each side a large base, but I want the particles to pull inside a little bit more, so they're not as uniform looking as they are here. Now in order for the particles to know where they have to go to create this pulling motion, we have to create an additional geometry. Specifically, we have to create just a couple of lines that will help us guide our particles. So let's go up, and we need to create these lines based on where our points are. So let's go to our points, and I might want to change the display here to points. And there are a couple of ways that we can create this line based on the points, but the easiest one will be to just give these points an ID. So I will do an attribute VOP here, and let's step inside, and we are going to create this ID attribute based on their point number. So from the ptnum we will do a bind export, and let's rename this to ID. And now I can go up, and now I can use a transform node here and merge the result of this transform node with our original particle. So if I just do a merge here and place the transform as our second input, if I do an add, we can go to polygons and we can set this by group, and I'll set this to by attribute, and attribute name will be this ID that we created. So now if I go back to the transform, if I increase the uniform scale here, we can see that we draw a line from where they originally were to where they are now with this transform node. So again, we have their initial position, then we alter their position with a transform node, we add these sets together, and because they have the same ID that we set over here, so let's maybe rename this to set ID. So because each point has the same ID value, when we add them together it simply draws a line between the points, and we can use this transform node now. Let's go ahead and set this uniform scale to 0, and I will just increase the position on the Y until we get the shape that we are looking for, and I might want to template the geometry as well, or rather it would be better if we template the particles. So let's template our particles, and I can better judge where our transform position should be. So I can increase the direction on the Y here to something like this, and we can now use this geometry to make our particles get closer to this curve based on their position. So let's do a null here, and let's rename this to curve. I'll go ahead and grab this node with Control C, and let's reference this in our geometry VOP here. So in input 3 SOP, I will set the path to be our curve. Let's go inside, and we will need to create a new vector which we will add to our original vector. So the result of this multiply, I will go ahead and duplicate our VOP global inputs, and we can use minimum position to grab the closest point where each particle would fall on our curve. So from op input 3 over here, which again references our curve geometry, let's do a minimum position. We will generate this min pos from our position. So if I want to preview this result, I can plug this directly inside the P, and we can see now that all of the particles, maybe I can do a mix here between their original position and their position on the curve. I can use this bias to demonstrate what's happening. So this is where they are initially, and again the min pos will find the closest position on our curve geometry. So each point will go over to this position where it finds on the curve. I'll go ahead and let's get rid of the position connection. I'll get rid of all of this. So now we want to create a vector from our position to this new position on the curve. So from our P, we will do a subtract. Let's subtract this minimum position, and we will add this to our original vector that already has this direction. So from this subtract over here, let's add this to our vector and let's see what we get. Now we can see that the particles are actually going away from our curve, and this is because we have to reverse our vector. So Shift R on this subtract. And now if I play the simulation, this will be the result. And this is the movement that we want. And for example, if I want to make this effect a little bit stronger, so I want this taper to be stronger, I can do a multiply constant here, and I can increase the length of this vector. So if I do a multiplier of 2 here, our particles will start to move towards our curve even faster. So we get this result. Now this is probably a little bit too much. Let's maybe use a multiply value of 1.3. This should be fine. Alright, and we can press play. So this will be the initial movement, and I can always just go up and go back to our points. And if I change our position for our point, so if I place this up, I can always go back, and now our particles and then our smoke simulation as well will follow wherever this point is. So let's maybe just place this back roughly where it was, to something like this, and I think we are on our way. And one final thing that we want to do here is also add a little bit of noise as well, like we did with our other simulations when we added the pop wind. Only in this case we are just going to add the noise directly inside our geometry VOP. So I will step inside here. Let's maybe just create another copy of our inputs, and we want to use a curl noise for this. So let's drop down a curl noise, and I will set the signature to 4D noise because we also want this noise to evolve. So from our P, we will do a vector to, let's see, vector to vector 4, and let's place the time as our fourth input. This will be our position. And for this curl noise, let's go ahead and use simplex, and let's place the result in our add and see what the default settings will give us. So let's press play, and I think this is actually looking pretty good with the defaults. I might want to reduce the amplitude just slightly, and I can increase the frequency, so the time frequency, the fourth component over here, to make this animate faster. So it's a little bit more chaotic and more like fire. Alright, maybe an amplitude of 0.8 will be my final value here. And I think maybe I want the points to be further apart, so we increase the length of this effect overall. So I will go to my points here, and I will just move them over to the side slightly more. Let's press play. Right, so this is slightly better. Now when I created the original simulation, I did spend a lot of time adjusting these settings, but this is mainly how I set up this entire pop simulation. Let's go to our merged result and see how everything is coming together. Alright, so this is pretty alright. Maybe I can use pixel display here. And I think I want to increase the radius of our fourth layer, so this one over here, and I can go back to the sphere, which again, these spheres are being used to cut up our sources over here, so I can increase this sphere radius a little bit more, and let's go ahead and resimulate. Alright, so I think this looks slightly better like this. Now again, I will leave you to fine-tune all of the settings to get exactly the movement that you are after. One other thing that I can see here is in the original example as well, my lateral points were also a little bit behind the character. So if I press enter, I can also bring them slightly behind, something like this, and I can resimulate. So it also has a little bit more depth like this. I think I can even place them even more behind and resimulate. Alright, so I think this looks slightly better. And by doing this, we can also get a really good idea of how the final simulation will look like. And at each point, I can go to each of these layers, and I can art direct this further and get exactly the movement that I'm after. So after we merge everything together, we can recolor all of these particles based on their rest attribute. So we have a rest attribute for all of our sources, and I will go ahead and grab either of these add noise attributes attribute VOP, so I'll go ahead and grab this, for example. So again, this is the one that's setting the color. Let's paste this over here, and we will use this as a base. Now, the default result will be using the position of where the points are in space. So what we want to do is go inside, and let's grab our rest attribute. So over here, I will type rest, and I want to use this as the position from where we get our noise values. And let's set this type to a tree float. So now the noise is sticking to the geometry, and I can increase the frequency, and I will also want to decrease the minimum amount. So I want to make this brighter overall, and maybe I want to increase the frequency even more, and let's set the speed here to a value of 2, and let's play the simulation. So we end up with something like this. And the reason we want to use a noise over here, and also I want to increase the offset for this, just so we make sure it's a different pattern from the rest. So the reason we want to use a noise here is because we are going to use these noise values to create our density attribute. So when we do the volume rasterize and turn all of these points into a volume, we want to have variation in this density, so we are going to use this noise values. Speaking of which, let's go back inside, and now our noise is currently assigned to our color, but we also want to use the same values as our density. So in between the fit range and the color, I will do a bind export, and over here I will also create this density attribute. So if I go up, we have one more thing that we want to take care of, and the problem that happens here is because we are overlaying a lot of particles together, we don't really have a consistent gap between the points, and this is pretty important when we turn the points into volumes. So for example, if I were to do a pyro scatter over this geometry, and this is just to illustrate something, so if I do a pyro source rather, so let's do this, and let's set the mode to surface scatter, we can see that the points have a consistent distance between each other. So let's also maybe use point display, and maybe I can decrease the particle separations so we can see this better. And this is the type of source that Pyro prefers as opposed to a regular scatter. So if I just do a normal scatter over here and turn off relax iterations and increase this, we see that the position of the points is a little bit random, and the points themselves are not really trying to stay away from each other, so they're not really respecting each other's space, especially when I compare it to the Pyro source like this. Now this isn't necessarily a big problem. Some of the time you can totally use the volume rasterize on scattered points that are like this. The problem is that when we are turning the points into volumes and we have a bunch of points like over here where they are very close to each other, when this is turned into a voxel, the density values of the points will be sort of added together, which means that we will have a much higher density where points are very close to each other, and a lower density where there's more space between the points. And especially in our simulation here, where we have really a bunch of points that are really close to each other and are kind of on top of each other, we will have a much higher density value in those regions, and that will make our Pyro simulation a lot harder to control. So we need to somehow turn all of these randomly scattered points into something more uniform. And the easiest way that we can do this is if we use a fuse node. So if I drop down a fuse, this will merge all of the points that are within a distance threshold that we set over here. So if I increase this to a value of 0.035, this essentially now means that for any given point, it's going to look in a radius of this value over here, so 0.035, and if it finds a point within that radius, it's going to merge the points. So we can see the result here if I turn this on and off, that we really get rid of a lot of these overlapping points. And wherever we have areas like this where there's not a lot of points that are overlapping, we kind of have the same result. But over here in these other areas where there's a lot of overlaps, we are only going to keep the points that we need in order to do our volume rasterize. So all I'm trying to say with this is that we kind of have to preserve a point separation value in this simulation in the same way that the Pyro source does for us automatically over here. So now that we have set up everything, we can go ahead and let's do a file cache. I will set this base folder to my job variable. Let's give this a base name, so this will be our pop sim. And because we are going to simulate this in real time and then speed it up, we need to cache a lot more frames than what we need. So if we want our animation to be 150 frames and we know we have to ramp up the speed twice or maybe even more, we have to make sure that we save at least 300 frames or more. So in my case, I will just save 500 frames to be sure, and I will save to disk. And now we are ready for the Pyro simulation. Let's go ahead, and after our file cache, I will just drop down a null, and this will be our orig pop sim, so original pop simulation. And I will grab this node and let's create our Pyro simulation chain over here to the right, just so we keep things organized. I will drop down an object merge and paste my particles here, and then we can access it from this object merge. So the first thing that we need to do is turn all of these points into a volume. So we will use a volume rasterized attributes. Let's set the attribute name here to be density, which is the one that we created with the noise. And by default, we don't have a particle scale. This will default to 1. And we want to set the particle scale to a lower value. Let's try 0.1. And we can probably keep this at 0.1 for now at least. And for voxel size, I will also leave this at the default 0.1 because we will link this later with the voxel size of our Pyro simulation. So let's also turn on velocity blur because we have a velocity attribute, and we can use this velocity blur option here to smear our particles in the direction in which they are moving, which will give us an overall smoother result for this volume. And it will also help us fill the gaps between the voxels. So for the main shutter setting here, let's set this to 1. Shutter offset, let's set this to -1, so it looks in the backwards direction. And let's also increase the blur samples, maybe 10 will be enough. So this will be fine, and this will be our density source. So let's rename this to SRC density. And we also want to use a second volume rasterized node. So let's go ahead and duplicate this by holding Alt. And the attributes that we want to rasterize here is going to be V. So this will be basically our initial velocity field that will drive the movement of the smoke. And it's going to be based on our particle source because we have this velocity attribute. So if I turn on the velocity display here, we can see the velocities for all of our points. And we are using these points to create this velocity field. So by default, the display of this isn't really helpful for us. So we can do a volume slice from here, and we can plug this into a volume trail. And if I visualize the result, we can better estimate how this velocity field looks like. And let's maybe create a null here as well, and we can use this to point to this velocity field. So we will name this to SRC-V. So the volume name for this will be this V over here. And for the volume rasterized attributes, we want to maintain sort of the same settings. So one thing that I will do here is I will reduce the particle scale for this to half, so 0.05. So now in terms of simulation, this will sort of have our velocity field will have a smaller influence on the movement of the smoke if the particle scale here is set to a lower size. And I know this ahead of time because of the initial test that I did. So we have to be mindful that the particle scale in both the cases for the density and also the V attribute, this particle scale is very important here. And once we decide on a certain particle scale, we usually don't want to change this. So we can change the voxel size and we can increase this resolution to get a higher quality simulation, but usually we want the particle scale to stay the same in both cases. One other thing that I can do for this velocity volume is we can do a point velocity before we do the rasterize. So if I go to this point velocity, let's set this initialization value here. Let's set this to keep incoming. So we maintain the original velocity attribute that we had, and I will go to the curl noise tab and just turn on this add curl noise, and I will increase the scale here maybe a bit, and let's decrease the pulse duration so we make this faster, and I will also decrease the swirl size. So now this will also add additional noise on top of the velocity that we already have, and we are going to maintain the velocity that we had for the most part, and we can use this to introduce just a little bit more variation to make our simulation have more interesting motion and more features. So we can come back and adjust these values values later. Let's go ahead now and I will drag these over to the side. I will grab the source density and the source volume, hold down Alt and drag a wire here so we can merge these volumes together, and then from here we can drop this into a Pyro solver. Okay, and let's go ahead and link up the voxel size. So let's right click, copy parameter. I will link it to our first volume rasterize and also to our second, so our velocity field. Let's go back to our Pyro solver settings and let's take a look here at some of the options that we will need. First things first, let's go to the sourcing and let's get rid of everything except for the density and our V. And since we have this V volume here that we created with the rasterize, we can go ahead and preview the simulation as it is, and we can see that it kind of has this direction that we are after, so the lateral spread and this upward movement of the fire, but the default sourcing here for the velocity is this add operation. So this will make our velocity field be a little bit too strong, and sometimes we want this operation to be add, but in the case of this specific simulation we want to blend in the velocities slowly over time, so we have a much more controlled motion. So I will set this operation here to pull, and if we are using a vector field, we want to turn on direction strength as well. And for the acceleration strength, this is how fast we are blending in the velocity field, so I will set this to a value of 10. And again, this 10 value here is what I ended up using when I did the original test, but it took a little bit of experimenting until I get to this value, so feel free to try different values for acceleration. Deceleration strength I usually leave to 1 for maybe 99% of cases. So we only have to usually worry about the acceleration strength. So let's go ahead and reset our simulation, and if I press play, we see now that the smoke is a little bit slower, but it's still going in the direction that we want. So this will be a decent start. Let's maybe go to our setup and let's decrease the voxel size here to 0.05. So now we essentially doubled the quality of this simulation. So if I press play, we get a much nicer result now. So let's fine-tune this simulation, and I will go to the fields here and make this dissipate a little bit faster. So I want the smoke to not last as much. I will just increase the dissipation here to 0.15 maybe. We also don't need this flame field because we are only dealing with smoke, and I will also turn on the speed field because we want to use this speed field to map different microsolvers to this field. Speaking of which, we can go in the shape tab and I want to turn on disturbance. Let's go ahead and I will maybe increase this value to, let's try a value of 3. Threshold field will look for density, so that's fine, and I will also turn on this use control field, which we can see that by default it will look for this speed field that we turned on over here in the fields tab. So let's go back here, and this essentially means that in order for the disturbance to be applied, the smoke will need a minimum speed of 0 over here. So I will just increase this and say that we need a minimum value of 0.2. So now wherever the smoke is not moving as fast, we won't have this disturbance take place. I will also turn on the turbulence, and for the settings here, we will set the threshold field to look for our density because we don't have a temperature field, and for the most part the default settings should be fine over here. Let's go ahead and reset the simulation and see what we get. So we can see a little bit of disturbance and a little bit more breakup, and also some overall noise from our turbulence. So I think this is looking all right. And now that I'm seeing our Pyro simulation, I can safely say that we might need a bigger source for our spreading layer back in our pop simulation. So now we can actually go back to our layers here. I will go to this spreading layer. Let's preview a few frames, and let's just increase the area of effect here. So I will go to my spheres here. Let's go to the sphere size, and I will just increase the uniform scale and just make this bigger. So now our source is bigger as well. And I will also grab our goals here. So I will grab this point, let's press enter, and I will drag this over to the side, and we can see that we have to go back to our spheres to readjust our sourcing. But I just want to make this lateral spreading a little bit bigger, and probably something like this will be fine. Let's go back to our sphere, and I will increase this size back. So now if I look at my simulation, all right, this I think will be a little bit bit better. So I want an overall bigger influence on this lateral spreading. Let's go back now to our first simulation, and for this first layer that just adds a little bit of overall noise throughout the simulation, I maybe want the particles to last a little bit less than they currently are. So in our pop sources, let's set the life expectancy here to 0.4, and let's reduce the life variance to 0.15. So I don't want these particles to last too long, so they push the pyro simulation even more, because we already have a lot of noise going on from our microsolvers as well. So let's check out the result, and I think this will be slightly better. So let's go back up, and we will recache all of our particles now. So this will be our new simulation. Let's go back to our pyro sim and see what this will give us. So let's press play. So now we sort of have a better result. We have a better silhouette of this effect. So I think we are on the right path now. Now, one simple thing that we can do with the simulation to help our smoke integrate better with the character is we can actually use the character as a collision object. So let's go to our geometry here. I will grab our geosource. So again, this is just our character. Let's go over here and let's do an object merge, bring in our character geometry, and we want to use SDF collisions. So let's do a VDB from polygons here, and since we are using an SDF, we can go ahead and grab the resolution of our pyro solver. Let's copy parameter, and we want the same resolution to be on our SDF. So for our SDF options here, we want to fill interior because we want to have information all the way inside our character for the collisions to properly work. And I can place this as our second input, which is our collision volume. So let's go to our pyro solvers, and in the collision tab, we can set this to SDF plus volume collision. And for the collision SDF, let's go ahead and remove this, and let's point this to our surface collision, because this is the name that was given by default when we create this SDF. Alright, so it's pointing to our surface, and we don't have a volume velocity because this is a static mesh. But if we would have been working with an animation, we could have used this velocity volume as well. So let's reset our simulation and see what we get. So now our smoke will follow the shape of our character mesh even better. So this will help us a lot when we are actually advecting our particles in the later section. And we can actually see that this looks pretty cool and pretty close to the final result. And just for fun, I can do a pyro bake volume from here just to shade this effect a little bit nicer, and I will turn off this assign material, which usually just gets in the way since I'm using redshift most of the time. So let's go ahead and uncheck this. Let's go ahead and let's enable scatter, and for the bindings here in the scatter tab, let's set our source volume because we don't have a temperature. We will set this to density, and let's go back to our scatter and play around with the settings and see if we can get something that looks a little bit cooler. So I will just mess around with some of these settings here, and we usually want to increase the density scale of our smoke, so I can increase this as well. And let's set the smoke color here to be something darker, so we end up with something like this. Maybe we can play around with the settings even more, or we can change this mask scatter until it goes the other way, sort of. So we can have something like this, or we can just go ahead and get rid of the density entirely, and probably we can just use the fire here. So in the bindings, let's also point the fire to our density and also the color volume. And now if I decrease this, we just have just plain old fire, and I think this looks actually pretty good. So we could definitely render this as a volume as well, but usually if we render it as particles, we kind of get a more magical and stylistic look. So that is the style that I'm going for in this effect, but definitely you could 100% render this as volumes. Alright, so let's leave this here for now. Let's go back to our pyro solver, and there's one final thing that we want to do here. Now, depending on the look that you're going for, this might be what you want, but I want the ends here for our lateral spread to be tapered a little bit more, so we increase the strength of the overall silhouette. So we are going to use the divergence field as demonstrated in the first lessons to help us squeeze our fire more into these 2 points. spheres on the sides here. And this is also good practice to show you different ways that you can control a pyro simulation. So let's go ahead and create this divergence field, and we will base it on our goals that we created here. So we can grab this entire setup that we have here, where we create our spheres that we use to cut a part of our sourcing. So I'll go ahead and grab all of these nodes, Control C, and I just want to bring them over here to the side. And let's go ahead and look at our, or rather template our particle source, and let's go over here. And I will leave these spheres as they are, and let's just turn them into an SDF. So from here I will do a VDB from polygons, and we don't really have to use a high resolution here, because this whole volume, this whole SDF volume is going to be simply to help us guide our particles into a specific shape, and we don't really need a whole lot of detail here. So I will leave the voxel size at 0.1, but we do want to fill interiors, so we do want to have information from the surface all the way to the center of each of these spheres. So we need to turn this fill interior option on, and the default name that we have here is going to be surface. Let's rename this to divergence, because we also have this surface name here where we are doing our collision. So let's go back here, I rename this to divergence, and now I can simply merge this. I'll go ahead and grab both of these nodes with the volume slice and volume trail and delete them. So this was only for visualizing our velocity field. I will grab this merge and just bring this up, and now I can plug this VDB from polygons. Let's maybe just drop a null here to keep things organized, and this will be my divergence. Alright, and I will plug this in our merge, and now in our Pyro solver, let's go ahead and reset this simulation, or go to the first frame, and in the sourcing let's add another source, and we want to source our divergence. We can see that we don't have this, we only get our density here, so we will just type divergence, and the target field will be divergence as well. And I just want to mention that this name that we gave this here doesn't have to be divergence, it can be anything. So we can do something like pool, and I would just have to use the same name here as pool. But the target field has to be divergence. So this is the built-in name that Houdini recognizes. The same way we have vel over here and density here. These names can't be changed, but the source volume can have any name that you want. Now for the operation here, I will want to blend the divergence values as well. So again, I will use a pool operation. And for the acceleration here, I found that a value of 25 was fine in this case. And I also increased the source scale to 8 here. And again, both of these values are values that I came up with by doing a lot of experimentation. So if I play the simulation now, let's also untemplate our source so we can only see the smoke. If I play the simulation now, we can see that we get this tapered effect that we were after over here to the sides. So our smoke is also pulling towards the center of our spheres, but also this is making our smoke contract, so we are losing volume towards the center here, which in turn will make this tapering effect even more pronounced. So this is perfect to what we want. And in fact, I will do a file cache, and I just want to show you the difference between using this divergence field and without. So I will go ahead and I will just cache maybe 80 frames, and I will let's set the base folder here, and maybe this will be our volume. Let's set the name here to velocity field and save to disk. Alright, and I will go back to our Pyro solver now and disable this divergence, and let's do another version without this divergence so we can compare. Alright, so check it out. This is with divergence and this is without divergence. So we can see that even over here in the head area, we are actually grabbing some of this density and pulling it towards the center of our spheres as well. So this is how we can use divergence to shape our pyro simulations in very specific ways. Now when I'm looking at these two simulations side by side, maybe the scale of this divergence effect is too strong, so I can go back to the Pyro solver. Let's turn this back on and let's reduce the source scale here by a value of 4, and I will go ahead and let's save to disk. So now when I compare, we have a tapered look over here, and we maintain sort of the overall motion. Now, like I said earlier, depending on what you're going for, you might not want to use this divergence technique over here, but it does come in handy a lot of the times when you are trying to get a very specific look for your pyro simulation, especially since the divergence, like I said, can help us reduce the overall volume of a simulation. And again, the default behavior of a pyro simulation is to preserve the volume. So it's very hard in general to squeeze the simulation in a specific point. So this will be our pyro simulation. Let's set this to the first version. I'll go ahead and remove the pyro bake, and from here I can drop down a null, and this will be our velocity field, so I will rename this to vel. And we can go ahead now and do our particle advection. And one final thing that I want to mention here is if I go to the Pyro solver, we set the divergence source scale here to a value of 4, but normally when we are sourcing in divergence and we are using positive values, the default behavior of the divergence is to expand the smoke. So normally in order to have the contraction, we would have to set this to a negative value, so we would have to use a -4 here instead. But the reason we don't have to do this is because when we create this SDF, so if we go to our spheres, our values inside the spheres already have a negative number. So if I do a, let's just do a VDB visualize tree from here and template our sphere geometry. So the way the SDF works is when we are going inside the geometry, we will increment a negative value. So we have a value of 0 on the surface, and when we go further inside, we will have -0.1, -0.2, and maybe in the center here we will have a -5 value. So because this value is already negative, when we go to our pyro source, here we don't have to set the source scale to a negative value. And this is specifically when we are working with SDFs. If you were to use a regular volume and you want to obtain a contraction, you would probably have to use a source scale with a negative value. So that's just a little FYI for this. And now we can work on the particle advection. So for this next part, make sure that you have watched the fixed particle stepping video and also the gradient advection video, where I go over in depth over the techniques that we are going to be using. So now to start with our particle advection, we will need a source. So we will need to source our points, and we can actually use the same source that we kept using when we created the initial pop simulation. So I'll go ahead and grab again these 4 nodes. Let's Control C, let's bring them over here, and in order to avoid this long line that goes along all of our networks, let's go ahead and get rid of this connection, and we will do an object merge instead, and we will point to our geometry node. So let's grab our geometry, Control C, let's paste this over here so we can recreate this chain, and we have this particle source. So we can go ahead and for our noise we can increase the frequency for this, and I want to decrease the minimum value, so we want to bring in more points, and we don't have to spend a lot of time right now because we can adjust this later, but I will want to increase the roughness here as well. So something like this will be fine, and this is perfect as a starting point. And now we will do our pop simulation. So let's drop this inside a pop net, let's go inside, and for our emission type set to all points, let's set the birth here, let's maybe give this life expectancy a value of 3, and we can come back and adjust this later, also introduce some life variance. So let's set this to 1, disable guides, and now we can do the advection. So let's do a pop advect by volumes, and we will go ahead and go up. Let's grab our velocity, Control C, and we will go ahead and point our SOP path to this velocity. For advection type, we want to use update position. For velocity update, for this we will do final velocity, because we do want to update the velocity of our particles towards the other frames as well. So let's press play, and let's first set this back to pixel display. I will play the simulation and let's see what we get. So we can see that by default this is a little bit too chaotic, and let's go ahead and do the volume gradient advection as well. So I will go up, and we want to compute this gradient velocity from our initial pyro simulation, and let's do a volume analysis, and we will compute the gradient here based on our density. So now I can also drop a null, so we can point to this. Let's rename this to gradient. Let's remember, however, that our new velocity value is based on the density, so the name will be density as well. So I'll go ahead and grab this null and Control C, and I can go back in our popnet. Let's duplicate our pop advect by volumes, and we'll plug this after our first one. And for the second pop advect, we will point this to our gradient null. And the field name here, like we mentioned, has to be now density. And by default, the velocity scale is way too high, so let's set this to a very low value, something like 0.01. And now if I play the simulation, we get a closer result to what we are after. So essentially, we are squeezing our particles towards where there are higher density in our smoke simulation, and this velocity scale I think is still too high, so let's set this to 0.005 and let's play the simulation. So I think something like this is very close to what we are after, and I think this will be fine. Let's make our particles last a little bit less, and I will set the life expectancy to a value of 2, life variance of 0.5. So let's play the simulation again. And I think the particles are still lasting too much, or rather too long. Let's go back inside, set the life expectancy to 1.5, and let's leave the life variance at 0.5. So I think this will be my final values for the life. Okay, so this is slightly better now. Let's also scatter fewer points here while we are working on the simulation, just so we have a faster preview. So I will reduce this force total count here, and let's reset our simulation. Alright, so this will be enough points for us to judge if we are having the result that we are after. And we can see that when I play the simulation, our particles stop at a given point here, and this is because I forgot to set the cache frames here. We also need to cache 500 frames for this. So I will set this to 500, and let's save to disk. And one other thing that I want to do here is, if I go inside, I want to blend in the velocity scale of both of these pop advect nodes. So let's go to the first one, and I will turn on this use expression, and we want to blend in the velocity scale based on our particle age. So this is exactly the same thing that we usually do, and the technique that I explained in the fixed particle stepping video. So we will say that vel scale multiplies equal to fit, and in between I will say at age, and from, let's say, 0 to 0.2. So this value here is in seconds. Let's blend this from 0 to 1, and also I want to blend in the scale of this second one as well. So I will turn on this use expression. Let's go to our first one, and I will just copy this expression here, and let's paste our code. And in the case for the second one, I want to blend this over a longer duration, so I want a slower blend. And in order to do this, I will increase the second value here for our fit expression. So I will say that maybe from 0 to 0.5, I will want to blend in the strength. So overall, this should help us get a smoother result from our sourcing position to the final position. So if I play the simulation, I'm not sure how noticeable this is, so you'll just have to trust me that this provides a better result for us. Also, following the same idea from our Pyro simulation, we can make our particles collide with the mesh as well, so with the character mesh. So I will make some room over here, and let's go up and grab our geometry. So over here where we have our geometry, I might just do a null to the side, and let's rename this to geocol for geocollision, and I will grab this null. Let's go back inside and do a static object and bring in our collision object, so our geometry, and let's merge this in our chain. So let's place this here, and be careful of the order here. So we have to make sure that the static object is on the left of this merge. Let's reset our simulation, and now we can see our geometry here. I'll go ahead and turn off display geometry because we don't really need to see this. And if I play the simulation now, again, this might not be super noticeable, but now it is colliding with the geometry. And when we do our higher quality resolution simulation and we scatter like 10 million points, this will be a lot more noticeable. Alright, so we are on the way. And now if I go outside, we see that we also bring in the collision geometry. So in the object merge here, we can set this object to be star pop and another star, so it will only export to the sub level the pop object, so only our particles. So this is the current state of the simulation, and what we can do from here is we can help create that tapered look even more on the sides of the simulation. And even though I'm pretty happy with how this looks, I do want to show you that you can still alter the motion of our particles after you advect them. So you can combine them with different forces, and we can create this force that will pull our particles closer to our goals by simply creating a vector from their position to our goals, sort of the same thing that we did earlier with the near point function. So let's go ahead and look for our goal points, so our lateral goals here. I will go ahead and I will just bring this over, do an object merge, and just bring this over here, and I will set this as our second input in the PubNet. Okay, so again, this object merge is simply our goal points. Let's go inside, and after our advection over here, we will do a geometry VOP, and let's set our second input here. We will use second context geometry. We could have done the same thing by setting this to SOP and just updating the path here, but I just want to show you that you can also use the context geometries. So if I go up, it's going to be this, it's going to be the inputs of our DOP network here. Anyway, let's go back inside. So this is looking at our goal points, and inside this geometry VOP, I can go ahead and let's do a near point function, and we will base this on our own position. And now this will retrieve the point number of our goal point, so it's either going to be 0 or 1. So we want to use an import point attribute to retrieve the position of our points. And again, the file will have to be our goal points file, so our second input. And then from our current position, if I subtract the position of our goal points, we essentially get a vector that's going to point towards these goals, and we can grab our current velocity. Let's grab the current velocity as it is and place it as our output velocity. So essentially we are doing no changes, and to this velocity I will then add this vector that we create with the subtraction. So I will plug the subtract result inside our add, and let's reset the simulation and see what we get. Alright, it's going in the other way. Let's go ahead, and for the subtract I'll press Shift R to reverse the order. So now we should get the correct vector, and if I reset the simulation, we see that we get the same result that we had earlier, but we also see that we are maintaining that advection that we had, so this flowing motion, but obviously this vector is too strong. So let's first of all normalize this vector. So let's do a normalize here, so it's a unit length of 1, and let's reset and see what we get. So now this is slightly better. Now this is actually a very cool result of its own, so hopefully this will give you some ideas of the stuff that you can do. But what I want here is I want to have a radius that determines the strength of this vector. So I only want this vector to be strongest here where we actually have the point. And in order to scale this vector by this radius, we can simply compute a distance from the current position of our particles to this end goal position. So using the same position here where we grab the position, we can grab our current position and we will simply do a distance. So we will grab the distance of our current position to the position of our goal points. And now essentially this creates this radius that we talked about, and to further control this we can also do a fit range. And now all we have to do is multiply our vector that we created here. So after our normalize we will do a multiply, and we will scale it with the result of this fit. Now currently we are looking for a distance value from 0 to 1, meaning that when our particles are going to be 1 unit away from our goal points, it's going to have a speed of 1. So first of all we need a reverse effect happening here. So I want the destination mean to be 1 and the destination max to be 0. And now essentially the closer the points are to this goal, the stronger this vector will be, and the stronger the pulling motion itself. So let's go ahead and resimulate and see what happens. Alright, so probably this is a little bit hard to tell, but for example, if I were to increase the source max here for our fit, this essentially determines the area of effect. So if I increase this to a value of 5, let's say, and reset the simulation, we can kind of see that this will start to grab the particles that are further away from the end goals, and it's going to move them towards the end goal. So let's maybe just go up and go to the top level here, and let's do a file cache so we can compare with and without this additional movement. So let's set the base folder here to job. This will be final pops, and we can probably only simulate 100 frames to test this. Let's save to disk, and then I will go to version 2 here. Let's go inside, and I will get rid, or rather disable, this geometry VOP node with Q, and let's go back up, and we will recache the simulation without this pulling motion. So as I check the versions now, we can clearly see the difference this additional motion has for us. So with this additional vector, we see that we enforce this lateral movement of our smoke, and I think this looks just slightly better. Now over here towards the head, I'm not sure how noticeable this is, but if I look at the version without the pulling and go back to the pulling version, I can kind of see that some of these particles from the head are pulling maybe too much towards our end goals, so we can scale down this radius that we were talking about. If I go back inside, let's enable this back, and let's go back here, and let's reduce the source max to a value of 3. Let's go up, and let's increment this maybe to version 3, and let's save to disk. So now if I compare the versions, this is with a radius of 5, and this is without any pulling, and then this is with radius of 3. So now that I'm seeing this, if I compare version 1 with our other version with a radius of 3, I think maybe a radius of 4 would have been the right balance between having too much and not having enough. So I will go back inside here and setting the radius for our source max here to 4, and now this should be good for our final simulation. Let's go ahead and I will just override version 1 and save to disk. Alright, so this will be our final sim. Okay, so now we can compare it with the pulling and without the pulling, and hopefully you will agree with me that with pulling we have a little bit more intent in the movement overall, and it's helping the effect give it a better and more pronounced silhouette. Let's take care of the coloring now, and because we added this noise here for our source, we have a lot of variation in our color. Now we don't actually have color, we're just working with black and white values, but we can map those values to a color gradient, and we can simply do this with a color node. If I set the color type here to be ramp from attribute, I can point this to the same CD attribute, so our own color, and now we have the same thing. And now I can grab this handle here and we can change this gradient to something that more closely resembles fire. So I will give this an orange color with a little bit of a red tint, and I also want to make sure that we have whiteness in this value, so we will reduce the saturation just a bit, and I will also squeeze this range a little bit so I can decrease this second value here to have a little bit more of a contrasty look. So let's maybe do something like 0.5, and honestly what I'm doing here is I'm just mimicking what happens inside the Pyrobake node. So if I do a Pyrobake volume, if I turn on the fire for example, we can actually just go ahead and I can copy parameters, so we can use the same ramp that Houdini uses for the fire, and I can just paste values over here. So this should give us the most accurate looking fire. I'll go ahead and get rid of this Pyrobake node, and something that I usually like to do with particles to visualize this better in our viewport, I can multiply the color, and this will give us a way nicer effect. So I will drop down an attribute VOP, let's go to our color, and let's place this back in our color, and in between I will do a multiply and I will promote the second input. So if I go up now, if I set this to 1, we have our original result, but now as I increase this, we start to mimic the way a fire would look. So if I increase this to a value of 3, we are getting a cooler result. And also the other thing that I usually like to do is I can set the alpha to a lower value. So the alpha is an attribute that Houdini internally recognizes, sort of like color or P. So I can just go inside here and I will do a bind export, and I will set this to be alpha with capital A, and I will promote this input. Let's promote parameter, and now if I go up, I can use this value here to make our particles a little bit more transparent, and we can see that we actually get a way cooler result. Now this won't affect our render in this case because we are using redshift, so it doesn't affect the material or the render unless we explicitly use this alpha attribute. Again, this is just for viewport purposes. hopefully you can agree with me that this looks a lot better and closer to what we are actually going to end up rendering. And now I can also increase the color multiplier, so our first value here, and this actually looks a lot more like fire. Essentially, when we reduce the opacity of our particles, we get that additive effect that happens in render time. So again, this is just something I like doing for viewport purposes, so I can rename this to viewport previs, and we can now play back our animation, and this is what we have. Alright, so pretty cool. Now I will admit that the way I colored these particles in this particular case, it's pretty simple and straightforward. We could have gotten a lot more complex by using the age of our particles to map certain colors, or use a rest attribute to generate some noise values, but honestly I think just a simple ramp in this case gets us maybe 95% there. So with that being said, I do encourage you to try out to color these particles in different ways and see what you can come up with. And one final thing that we have to do here is we have to speed up our particles. So we can do a retime, and I want the input frame range to match our cache frame range from the file cache. So I'll go over here, and whatever cache we are using here, I will copy parameter, and I will want to paste relative references here. And let's just set this speed to a value of 2 and see how this will look. Alright, and this stops because we don't have enough cached frames, but this will be enough for us to tell if it's fast enough. So probably I think we can go even further. We can do something like 2.4. Let's try this. Okay, so I think this actually looks pretty alright. Now I know that we have to cache again 500 frames, so it matches our other simulations. I'll go ahead and set this to 500. And because we have to cache a lot of particles, we can also clean up the attributes of our particles so we don't store as much data on our hard drive. Let's do an attribute delete here. And if I look at my point attributes, let's go to our attribute delete. If I look at all of the point attributes, we kind of need the color and the velocity and the age maybe if we want to do further adjustments. And we see that we have a lot of these heat attributes, so heat NML, heat num, heat path. We don't need all of this. So I will say that if your attribute starts with heat, I want to get rid of all of those attributes. So I will type heat and followed by a star. And if I look at the attributes, we don't have any of these heat attributes, so this will help us save a little bit of disk space. Now if I go forward until we have all of the particles on the screen, we are working with roughly 140,000 points. So if I go to the scatter over here and I add another 0, this will mean that we will end up at 1.4 million particles. And let's say that I want around 10 million, so I will probably have to add another 0 here. So now we are working with 14 million points. Now this might be a little bit too many. Let's just, I will turn this first 4 into a value of 3. So probably this will make us end up at around 9 million points, which should be plenty. So now I can go ahead and let's save to disk. So we can take a look at our final result now. So I think this is looking really cool. Even as a viewport preview, I think this is looking great. And maybe I can also preview the geometry so we can get a better idea. But I can say that I'm very happy with this result. So this will be our main layer. And I also want to show you how to create some really cool looking embers like this. Because even though this looks pretty simple, there's actually quite a bit of stuff that you have to get right to get a really cool and convincing result. And now we can start creating the embers. Let's create another geometry container, and I will rename this to FX Embers. And I will step inside. We can start with any kind of source, and we should keep this source as simple as possible. So I will just drop down a grid. I will press enter in my viewport, and while holding shift, I'll grab these handles on either side, and I just want to make this a little bit more thin, and I can also maybe expand this region a little bit. And we can use this as a source for our particles. Now it's always good to introduce some noise to your sources, so in order to have enough resolution here, I will drop this into a remesh, and probably 0.2 here will be fine. And then I can use a mountain node, and I will turn off this noise along vector, and I can increase the element size. So we just want to add a little bit of noise, and we can also animate this noise. So in the animation tab, I will turn on animate noise, and let's take a look at the speed. Maybe we can reduce the pulse length to make this faster, and I believe this will be fine. Let's increase the amplitude slightly. and now we are good to go. So from here I will do a scatter. Let's turn off relax iteration, and we only want to scatter a few points here, and we want to randomize the global seed. So for expression here I will use $FF. So now we get a different scatter each point, and we want to give these particles some initial velocity, so we can do the same thing we did in our initial pop simulations, where we create a separate point that we can use to drive our vector. So I will drop down an add. Let's create this point and let's press enter, and I will just drag this down slightly. We will go back to our scatter and let's do an attribute VOP. Let's plug the point in the second input here, and I will rename this attribute VOP to set V. Let's go inside and let's grab this point position. So we will do an import point attribute, promote the ptnum to a constant of 0, and we can do a subtract. So we will subtract our position from the point position, and if I plug this result inside the V, let's also turn on the visualizer, which is set to this V attribute, and now we can visualize this velocity. So now I can go up and I can grab this point, press enter, and let's say that I don't want as much lateral spread, so I will just place this point a little bit more below, and I think this will be fine. Let's go ahead and normalize this velocity value so we can better control this vector, and also we can randomize the length of this vector now. So let's generate a noise. I will just copy over my inputs, and we can do a turbulent noise for this. We can leave this as 1D input because we want to randomize the length, and let's leave this at alligator noise, and we will multiply what we have by this value. So if I plug this here, this will be the result. Let's actually set the noise to a simplex, and let's do a fit range here so we can control the values, and I will reduce the source min to -0.5 and also the source max as well. And I can go to the turbulent noise and I will increase the frequency and also the roughness, so we introduce even more variation. And we want to animate this noise, and the easiest way that we can do this is we can use the time to create a new vector. So I will plug the time inside a float to vector node. Let's use this as our second component, and let's plug this inside the offset. So now our noise is animating as well, and this will be fine for our starting point. Let's go up and I will remove the visualizer. Let's plug this inside a popnet and let's do our usual setting. So we'll go inside, and for the pop source we will use all points, turn off the guide, and for the birth let's start with a value of 5 and a variation of 2. Let's press play and see what we get. Now we do have this nice velocity, so I'm pretty happy with the direction, but obviously we need these to go faster, so we can go inside the attributes tab, and there's this inherit velocity scale here that we can use. So if I just increase this and set it to 10, now our particles will be 10 times as fast, but they will maintain the direction that we set. So if I play the simulation, we get this result. So this is fine for now. Let's introduce some drag to these particles. So we will do a pop drag and let's attach it here. By default the resistance is 1, so let's see what this will give us. Okay, so we have a nice initial burst and then they slow down. We might want to reduce the air resistance, so let's try a value of 0.25, and let's also adjust the life of our particles. So let's go to the birth tab here and let's set the life expectancy to a value of 2 and a life variance of 1. So I want them to disappear way sooner. So let's reset the simulation and see what we get. Okay, so we are getting closer, and the one thing that we can do to introduce more variation is we can randomize this air resistance per particle. So what we can do is we can turn on this use expression and we can do a quick vex line to randomize this resistance. So this parameter name will be air resist, so I will type this here. And I want to take whatever value we have and I want to multiply it with a random value based on the ID of the particles. So we will do multiply is equal, and we can do rand, which will give me a random value between 0 and 1, and we want to use the ID as our seed. So now if I play the simulation, some of the particles will have a lower resistance and some of the particles will have a maximum resistance of 0.25. Now we can also further control the 0 to 1 value if we do a fit range. So we can do fit 0, 1, and in between parentheses, let's say that maybe we want to scale this resistance between 0.5 and let's maybe say the maximum 1.4, and let's see what this will give us. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with this result so far. The final thing we will need is also some wind, so let's also add a pop wind. Let's turn on the amplitude. We need quite a higher amplitude here. Let's try 1.5. Let's also reduce the pulse length a little bit and let's see what this will give us. So we can see that the pop wind is working, so I'm pretty happy with this. We might want to increase this amplitude even further, and I might want to have even less resistance. Let's try a value of 0.15. So I don't want them to stop so abruptly. So let's play our simulation, and I think this is slightly better. And one other thing that we can do is we can randomize this initial velocity, so we can randomize the direction itself. So if I go up and look at my velocity attribute with our visualizer, we randomize the length of this vector, which pretty much randomizes the speed, but we could also randomize the direction. So what we will do here is let's go inside here and let's do another copy of our inputs. In fact, I will just go ahead and grab all of these nodes with the turbulent noise and I will copy all of these. So we also have this vector here that animates our offset. And for the settings here, I want to use a 3D noise and we will leave this as simplex. And now I can add this on top of my original vector. So what I can do is actually we want to add this here after our normalize. So let's do an add. And I will plug the result of this 3D vector here. So now we can see that we start to randomize the direction, and if I increase the amplitude and maybe even the frequency, now we will have even more variation in the movement. So if I go to the popnet, let's take a look. Alright, so now we have a lot of variation. Maybe as I'm seeing this, I want to adjust the pop wind, so I will go to this and I want to increase the swirl size. I want the randomness from the pop wind to have sort of larger swirls in the movement. Okay, so we end up with something like this. Let's maybe set the display to points. Okay, so I think this looks pretty good. And also I think we have maybe too many particles, so I will go up and I will just reduce the scatter amount. Let's use maybe a value of closer to 50. So I think this is slightly better with less particles. So this will be our particle simulation, and now we actually have to create the mesh of our embers. And it's not really enough to render these particles as plane spheres or just simple points. We have to actually create a mesh that more closely resembles what an ember would look like without any motion blur. So if I check the ember render that we have here, we can see that there's actually a lot of texture in most of these embers. Even though there's obviously a lot of motion blur and depth of field, we can see that it's not really a plane sphere that gets this motion blur applied and it's creating this streak effect. It's actually a shape that has a lot of variation in the silhouette and also in the texture as well. So this is how you can achieve more believable embers. And on that note, we can go back here and we can create this ember mesh. And we will start with a simple circle. So to the side I will drop a circle and I will set the orientation here to be ZX. So I want this to be flat on the ground, and I will increase the divisions here. Let's maybe try a value of 150. We will leave the type as closed, and we want to alter the silhouette of this circle. And we can do this with an attribute noise node. So we will drop a mountain here, and the default behavior for this node is to have this noise along vector, which is what we want because we want to alter the silhouette, but we don't have this normal vectors. So we simply want a vector that's tangent to our circle points, and we can achieve this by dropping down a polyframe. And I will turn off the normal name, and for the tangent name we'll set this to be our normal. So I'll set this to N, and if I turn on the point display, we see that we have this direction now. So this is the direction in which I want the noise to be applied. So if I go to this mountain node, we can use this to only alter the silhouette of our circle, and we can see that this is still flat on the ground, and this is what we want. So I will increase the amplitude here. So let's go ahead and play around with the amplitude and maybe the element size. We can also go in the fractal settings here and we can introduce more roughness. I might want to increase the element size and maybe the amplitude. So we just want to break up that circle shape with this noise. Alright, so I think this will be fine. And from here what we can do is drop a remesh, and I can press Shift W to preview this wireframe, and I want to maybe introduce more subdivisions, so I will set this. Maybe let's try 0.15, and now I want to use a second mountain node, so we will drop another one, and for this one we don't want this noise along vector, so I will turn this off, and I just want a noise that alters the shape overall, so I will reduce the amplitude here. And I think simplex is fine, but we can also try sparse convolution for this. And if I decrease the element size, I can also decrease the amplitude. So now we have this overall noise. Let's go ahead and let's set the target size for our remesh even lower, so we have more resolution, and we end up with something like this. I think I want actually the simplex version here. Let's increase the element size and decrease the amplitude. So I think something like this is fine for our Ember mesh, and we can do a null here, and let's rename this to Ember source, and we can plug this inside a copy to points and use our particles as our template points. So now if I look at the result, obviously the size here is way too big, so we can start adjusting our particles, and we want to do an attribute VOP after we simulate them. Let's rename this to set p scale, and I want to fade the scale of the points as they age. So let's go inside our attribute VOP, and we can use the normalized age for this, which is a value that goes from 0 to 1 along their entire duration. So we will do a bind, and let's grab this nage attribute, so nage, and we can do a bind export from here, and let's export this to p scale. Now it currently goes from 0 to 1, and we want the reverse of this, so I will do a ramp parameter in between our binds here, so we can further control what happens, and I will set this to a spline ramp, and I also want to give this a name, so let's do ramp p scale, and I will copy this to the label as well. So if I go up, let's go to our copy to points and see the result that we have. So they start off with a p-scale of 0 and increment to a value of 1 over their entire duration. So what we want is the reverse. I will click this button here to reverse the ramp. So now they start from 1 and they will go to 0, and I will want to maybe adjust the ramp. So I might want to have them fade out only in the later half of their life. And I will grab all of these handles and set them set the interpolation here to B-spline. So for the first half of their life, they will have a p-scale value roughly of 1, and then over the next half they will fade to 0. Let's go inside here, and we also want a global multiplier for the scale. And we can do a multiply here and promote the second input. So this can be our global p-scale. And if I go up, now I can control and set exactly how big I want them to be. Also, I want to randomize their p-scale for each particle. So we have to generate a random value. So let's go back inside and let's do a random value based on our ID. So from ID we will do a random, and we can also map this 0 to 1 random value that we get to a separate ramp. So let's do another ramp parameter, and let's rename this to ramp random, and I will copy this to the label as well and set this to a spline ramp. Let's plug our random result here, and let's multiply our value by this as well. So if I go up, I can reset this ramp random, and we can create an exponential ramp here. So I want most of these to be rather small and only have a few portions that are really big. So I will create another point here and drag this over and grab all of these, and we will set them to B-spline. So now I can further control this, and as we can see here, now only about 5 to 10% of the particles will have their full p-scale age. And currently we have a lot of particles that actually have a p-scale of 0. So we can grab this first value here, and let's say that the minimum value that I want this random to have is going to be, let's just increase this to maybe 0.2, and I can also drag this node up a little bit, or rather this handle. And I can adjust the global p-scale now, So this is our current result. And in order to preview this faster, because we have a lot of geometry, we can go to the remesh and we can decrease the target size. So let's use a value of 0.3 just so we preview this faster in our viewport, and then when we do the rendering we can set this back to a value of 0.1. So if I play the simulation now, this is our result. So I think this is pretty good. One other thing that we can randomize is going to be their orientation, and the easiest way that we can do this is if we drop an attribute randomize and we want to randomize our n attribute, so the normal, and we will set this to be direction or orientation. So now all of the particles have a random orientation, and whenever we want to use this attribute randomize node and we are working with particles, it's very important that we go to options and we enable this seed attribute to look for our ID. And let's check our simulation. So everything is working nicely. So we randomize our orientation and we randomize the p-scale, but we still have the same shape for all of our embers, and this is not realistic. So what we want to do is randomize the shape itself. And if I go to my ember source, so our mesh, we could simply randomize the offset value of our noises. So we can see that if I grab this mountain noise and I change the offset here, we get a different shape entirely. So this is the value that we want to randomize. Now we can link this offset value and randomize it based on the ID of the particles. So each particle would get a different shape, but this takes a little bit of computation time and is going to make our simulation slower, and we don't really need a completely different shape for each particle. What we can do instead is we can just create 10 predetermined variation of this shape and randomize that predetermined shape for all of the particles. So let's go ahead and see how we can create 10 variations. Here we can use a for loop block. So I will drop down a for loop with feedback, and since our circle and our polyframe, so these two nodes here won't really change, and the only values that I want to change is going to be the offset values in our mountain, we can set our for loop to begin after our polyframe, and let's make it end after our third mountain node here. So if I look at the result, we are not really getting the expected result. Let's set the iterations maybe to a value of 3 and start from there. And the problem this is giving us a wacky result is because the gather method here is set to feedback each iteration, and what we want to do is merge each iteration. So we simply want to create a new variation of our shape and merge it with the other shapes as well. So I will set this to merge iteration, and then in our block begin, we don't want to fetch the feedback, we want to fetch the input. So each time this for loop will run, it's going to start back at our polyframe nodes, so at our base shape. And if this is set to fetch feedback, it would mean that it's going to do all of the operations with our mountain nodes and the remesh, and it's going to start at that result. So it would recursively iterate on the already modified shapes. But what we want to happen is to start at the circle each time, and we just want to randomize the noise values. So again, we need to set this to fetch input, and here we want to merge all of our variations together. So in order to randomize this value now, we will need to create from our for loop block, let's create meta import node, so we have access to the iteration number, which we can use as a seed in a random expression. So I will go to our first mountain node and I will click on this cogwheel here, and I want to add spare input, and we will point this to our block metadata. So I will drag this over here in the spare input slot, and I can access the information of this block now with a detailed expression. So inside our offset value here, I will type detail, and to access our node, in between parentheses I will type -1. We want to look for iterations, so in quotation marks I will type iteration, and this only has one component, so I will set this to 0. And now it's going to simply look at the current iteration number. So if we have 3 iterations here, it's going to go 0, 1, 2 and 3, and this will be the offset that we are going to use. And we want to do the same thing for our second attribute noise node, and let's add another spare input, point this to our block begin metadata, and inside the offset I will just actually copy the expression that we have over here. So I'll grab this, copy it over here, and I might want to just add a random value here. So let's add a value of 5, just so it's a different value from our first expression. And now if I look at the result, we have the 4 variations that we created, and we can see that they are right on top of each other, but this is fine. If I were to go to single pass and check each individual variation that we get, we can go to 1, 2, so we have these 3 variations. And now I can create more, so let's just increase this, let's do 10 variations. And I can also check each variation and see what we get. So this will be all of our predetermined shapes for our embers. Alright, so I will turn off single pass, and in order to randomize this shape for each particle, we will have to work with packed geometry. So also before the end of this for loop block, I will drop down a pack here as well. So now these are packed, and we see that we have only 10 points here, so 1 point for each of our variation. And now in our copy to points, we can use this piece attribute option here to randomize the shape for each of our particles, and we just have to create an integer value that corresponds to each separate variation. So since we have 10 variations here, we will need to create an integer attribute that has random values between 0 and 9. So in total we will have 10 variations for that attribute. So let's go ahead and do another attribute VOP after our attribute randomize. So on our particles, let's rename this to set var, and we can give this attribute any name that we want. Let's go inside, and from the ID here, let's do a random, and we have to fit this attribute like we mentioned from 0 to 1 to 0 and 9, and we have to turn this into an integer value, otherwise this doesn't work. So from here, let's do a float to integer, and we can do a bind export, and like I said, we can give this attribute any name we want. Let's set a type here to integer, and we will just use name var. And now I can go up, let's go to our copy to points, and if I turn on this piece attribute option and set the attribute name here to var, which we just created, now all of our particles will look at our ember source, and it's going to randomly grab one of the 10 variations that we created for our mesh. So if we look at our points, we can see that this has a different mesh and this is using a different one. So now we really have a lot of variations. So we randomize the orientation, the p-scale, and we can also see that this is running in real time. So I'm running this at 24 FPS. Now I can go ahead and go to the remesh here and increase the target size. So let's set this back to a value of 0.1, so we can have a nice high quality resolution mesh, as we can see here. And this is running in real time as well, and this is because we packed our points. So we don't have to store each shape in the memory, we are just copying the memory footprint of either one of these 10 shapes that we create. So we can see that this is a very efficient simulation. And on that note, because we are working with packed primitives now, let's go up, and for our render settings we have to go to the Redshift OBJ tab, and whenever we are working with packed primitives we have to go to instancing tab here, and let's turn on instance SOP level packed primitives, otherwise we won't be able to render these in Redshift. So we created this mesh for the embers, but this is really only half of the process. The other half would be creating an actually interesting material. And because we are going to generate a procedural texture in Redshift, we need this texture to stick to the particles. So let's go back inside, and what we can do is we could set up a UV attribute for our shape, but the other approach would be to create a rest attribute and point the texture positions to that rest attribute. So this way the texture sticks on the embers. So I'll go ahead and add this rest attribute for our sources here. So let's drop down a rest position, and now we can map all of our noises to this rest attribute. And with this we are done with our embers, so I can drop down a null from here, and this will be, let's say, out embers. Now in the render there's also this fire that's behind our character, and we can see that this is a very subtle effect here, and I wasn't really sure if I wanted this layer or not, but I decided to go for it anyways. So it's not just simply a black background behind the character, and this is the render without any compositing effects, and this is pretty simple to create. So I just want to run you through the setup in Houdini real quick. So let's go in Houdini. So to start off this fire effect, we start with a simple grid, then we do a remesh to introduce more subdivisions. With a mountain node we noise up this source, And then I also do a bend deformer here, so it wraps a little bit more around our character. So if I do show all objects, the character is actually facing the other way, but I want this firewall to have this curved surface as far as the emission goes. So let's go ahead and hide other objects, and from here we scatter our points, we add some noise to the points, and we get rid of all of our black points. So exactly the same setup that we used in our initial pop simulations. And for optimizing this source, we grab the camera frustum and we use this to group our points that are intersecting with this camera frustum, and we delete all the other points. So this is again to optimize our simulation, so we don't end up simulating stuff that's outside of the field of view of our camera. And then with an attribute VOP we generate a velocity vector, and here we are creating this vector with all of the same operations that we kept using in the other setups. And then we can use this as a source inside a pop simulation. So if I press play, this is the pop simulation, so very basic. And then we can use this simulation to create our density, which looks something like this after we do our rasterize. We also introduce even more variation in the velocity with a point velocity node with this add curl noise option, and we rasterize these points to turn this into a velocity field. Then we bring both of these together, so our volume sources, and we plug this inside a Pyro solver. And in the Pyro solver I'm using pretty much the defaults here. If I go to the sourcing, we have our density source and target field density, and we are sourcing the velocities in our vel field with this spool method that we used earlier as well. And inside the fields tab we have this speed volume, and then in the shape tab we use disturbance and turbulence, and for disturbance we are pretty much using the defaults and mapping the control field to our speed, and for the turbulence we just add a little bit of amplitude here, so we can see that these are very basic settings. And then this will be the cached result, and I'm also using a Pyro bake volume here just to preview this better in our viewport. But really the material is created entirely in Redshift, and this is again just for viewport purposes. So this is the setup for how to build all of these effects and all of the layers. And in the next lesson I want to show you also how I render these layers. And all of the renders have a very simple setup, but there are a few tricks here and there, so I just want to go over real quick on the material setup and some of the render settings that I used. For the renders we have this main layer, which will be the fire and the character itself. So this fire is rendered as particles, and if I go to the scene view, we have our fire node over here. And since we already set up a p-scale at the SOP level, the only thing we have to do here, since I'm using Redshift, is to go to this Redshift OBJ tab, and I have to go to the Particles tab and check this option to render object as particles. And I also use this global scale multiplier. Since we have millions of points over here, we have to use a really low p-scale value, so I'm using this multiplier option over here, and I'm scaling them way down to 0.05. And when it comes to rendering emissive particles, like in this case, the challenge is always going to be finding a balance between the p-scale value and the emission intensity inside the material. So again, for this OBJ tab, the most important thing is going to be setting the p-scale here and setting this option here to render object as particle. And now let's check out the material that I created for this. So in the material tab I have this PRT material, and if I step inside, this is a very simple material. So for the main settings here I'm using 0 weight on the color, so I'm using no color, I'm setting this to 0, no reflection, this is again 0, and really the only thing that I'm using here is going to be the emission channel. And for this we are grabbing the color of the particles with this particle attribute lookup node. So this is set to bring in our CD, and I'm also filtering this through a ramp. So this isn't really necessary, especially if we already set up the colors of the particles at the SOP level, but since I wanted to have some extra control, I decided to create this ramp over here, and we can see that this is almost exactly like the ramp that we set up at the SOP level, so the one that we grabbed from our Pyro bake volume. The only difference here is that I added an extra handle right over here, which introduces just a little bit more red color into the emission. But like I said, this isn't 100% necessary, especially since we are doing further grading inside of Nuke later. And for our intensity, I set this to a really high value. So I usually set the emission intensity for the particles really high, so I can get nice reflection and GI and subsurface scattering on our objects that interact with the particles. And then since we are separating the AOVs inside of Nuke, I can grab only this particle layer and I can scale it down. So if I go to the render here, I can check out the AOVs and we can see if I go to some of the reflections and the GI. So here we have the reflection and we can see that this is really bright, and also our GI as well, and our subsurface scattering. So I usually prefer to have these layers a bit brighter so I can scale them down if necessary, because it's a lot easier to do it in this way rather than having them too dark and then scaling them up, because we don't really have enough color information. And I prefer having all of the layers brighter than they need to be. And now if I go to the emission, we have this here, and even though this looks pretty cool as it is, we are going to scale this down, the brightness of this in Nuke. So I can also go to the redshift options over here and I can demonstrate this. If I were to, let's say this to filmic and also apply to non-beauty AOV, so I can scale this down, and we can see that this is what we will actually end up with. So I have to scale this way down by a strong multiplier here, but we will see this in a second in Nuke. So I'll go ahead and reset it to default. And again, this emission intensity that we set here is directly related to our P scale for the particles. So if the particles were bigger here, so instead of this 0.05 value, I would have a 0.5 value, so they would be 10 times as big, I wouldn't need to set this emission weight so high. And this is only a high value here because all of the particles are really small, so they need some extra strength in order for the particles to have brighter reflections in GI and subsurface scattering. Now for the model itself, this will depend on what kind of character you are using, and in this case this model was made up of a lot of different parts. So if I go to the material tab, if I go up over here and I go to the left, we really have a lot of materials here. So there's a separate material for all of the clothing items and the sword and body parts and really all of the assets. So this is why we have a lot of materials only for the character. So any character that we use will have a different setup. But what I want to go over in this case is to make sure that if you are working with an organic character, so something that has skin like a human or any kind of organic character, the skin material has subsurface scattering. So if I go in any of these skin materials, if I go inside the skin body for example, we can see that over here I'm using a texture in the subsurface scattering color. So this texture is really the albedo of the character, or base color if you're more familiar with that term. And instead of pointing this in the base color, over here I'm using subsurface scattering, which is set to mode random walk. And I also have this radius color that closely resembles something like a skin tone. And if I look at the subsurface scatter AOV, so if I look at my SSS, let's check this out over here. This is how I got this very nice and detailed pass. And it's the layer that's going to make the interaction between the fire and the character more believable. And again, this is only in case you are using a human character or an organic character. So if you're using something like a mech or something like that, you don't have to worry about SSS. But I just wanted to cover this part real quick. So this is for the character and the main fire render. Let's go ahead and also take a look at our Embers setup. For the Embers, we only had to worry about the Embers object. So we can see here inside this redshift drop, I'm only pointing the objects at our render object. So in our OBJ tab, we are only concerned with this. We don't have to worry about how this interacts with the character, since the embers are going to be in front of the character and the fire anyway. So for the settings for this embers object, over here we have to make sure again that we go to the instancing tab and we enable this instance sub-level packed primitives. So the same thing that I mentioned earlier. And now let's check out the material for our embers. And to better see our materials, I'll go ahead and disable the motion blur and the depth of field effects so we can better see the texture. So I'll go to the out tab, let's go ahead and I will disable motion blur, and I'll also go to my camera settings and disable the bokeh effect. So now if I zoom in on an ember, this is actually how it looks, and this is the texture. So this is achieved through the simple material. Inside these material settings, I only have a base color here that's slightly dark. I have a bit of reflection with roughness, and then inside the emission channel, the emission is driven by a noise. So this is a Maxanoid that's using type blister turbulence, and I alter the settings here just slightly to get a cooler pattern, and I'll grab this noise and press R so we can just preview the noise, and we can see that this is what we get. So this black and white noise I'm filtering through a ramp to get this fiery look, and this is the ramp. Again, it's almost exactly the same fire ramp that we kept using, and then to get this really bright emission, I'm increasing the emission weight here to a value of 10. So the more I increase this value, the brighter our embers will be, and in this case a value of 10 was fine, but I could also set this to 50, and we can see that kind of look that we get. And then when we add our motion blur, so if I enable motion blur in our render op, we also have to check this option here to enable instances and particle blur. Since we are working with instances, we get this very nice streak here, and we can see that each shape has a lot of breakup in this streak that it creates. So again, if our embers were just normal particles like spheres, we wouldn't be able to get all of this detail, and this detail is also a result of our noise that we are using in the texture. So this is how I got this ember render layer to look more realistic and just a little bit cooler overall. And then finally we also have our firewall, and again for this render op I'm only pointing at the fire, and let's go over the fire material as well. So I'll go up over here, and inside the fire we are using a volume shader with the density set to 0. So really we are just using the emission, and since in our simulation we don't have a temperature or a flame field, we only have the density field, I'm mapping the emission channel to density. Scale is 3, so the more we scale this up, the brighter our fire will be, and I'm using the same ramp that we used in all of our other renders, so this ramp from black to orange. And again, if I wanted this fire to be brighter, I could just increase the scale here, and this is the result that we will get. Or we could make this darker if we wanted to. So this is a very simple render setup. So this is how I render the layers, and now we can move forward with the Nuke part and recreate the comp. Let's go ahead and start our comp, and we have the 3 main render layers over here, and I will grab this render with the character and the flames, and let's start by separating all of our AOVs. So from here we can do a shuffle, and inside this shuffle node I will go to the node tab over here, and in between brackets I will say I will type a value in 1 and close brackets, and this expression now simply tells us which channel we shuffle over here in our title. So if I go to the shuffle tab and I switch this to depth, now we will get the depth over here. Let's start by shuffling out our diffuse, and I will link these up by simply dragging them over. So this will be our diffuse, and from here I will press M to add a merge node. Let's go ahead and drop another dot over here with control. I will go ahead and copy this shuffle node with the dot by pressing Alt C, and I can drag this over and rearrange these nodes so we can start creating a network over here, and add another dot with control. And all of these merge operations for our shuffles will set to plus. So let's set the operation here to plus, and I will also grab this merge node and let's press Shift X to reverse the order. So I want the B layer to be first, and over here to the right we will add our A layers. And because our render also has alpha information, so if I press A we can see the alpha of our character, we will have to unpremult all of our shuffle nodes to do the grading properly, and then we will do a premult at the end. So after the shuffle we will do an unpremult, and let's add another unpremult to this one as well. And for our second shuffle, let's select our specular. So we need the diffuse, specular, reflection and GI to recreate the beauty pass for our character, and I'll go ahead and grab all of these nodes, press Alt C to create a copy. I will link these up, then I will press Alt C again, and let's link these up as well, and then I can grab all of these, press Alt C, and let's link these up again. So we just created duplicate of all of the shuffle nodes, and now we can go one by one and select what we want. So we have the diffuse, we need the specular. Let's go ahead and bring for this third one the reflection. Then we will need our GI, And then finally we will also need our subsurface scattering in this case. So let's bring this SSS channel over here. And we have 2 extra that we don't need, so let's go ahead and get rid of these, and I'll drag this over. So if I look at this result, we have our character. And we can check all of these layers one by one and see what each layer adds to our render. And we can also grade them now separately. So after we add all of these up, we have to bring back the initial alpha channel that we use. So from our final merge node, I will press K to add a copy node, and we will point this second arrow to our main render, and I'll add another dot here to keep things organized. And we want to reverse the order here, so I will press Shift X because we want to grab the alpha from our main render and copy it over to our merged result with the shuffles. And now that we have our alpha information back, we can do a pre-mult, and this will get rid of any border errors that we might have. And for this unpremult to work, we actually needed the alpha information. So in our shuffle nodes, we also have to bring the alpha from our main render, and we can select the alpha from over here from this second row in the shuffle. Let's point to our alpha and let's connect this here to our output layer, and we have to do the same for all of these other unpremolts as well. So if I select the alpha here, let's go ahead and grab this, point it to our output alpha, and now when I go to the unpremult, we see that we have an extra layer here around the edges of our character. And we will do the same for all of the other shuffle nodes. So I will just do this now. And now we can add a grade node with G and hook this up for all of our channels. And for example, I can grab the diffuse and I can gain this down, and I'll do the same for the specular. And now I can also control this. So we'll see this highlight on the head disappears, and also a little bit on the skin as well. Let's take a look at our reflection. So this will be an important layer. I can increase the gamma and increase the gain to increase the contrast. Let's do one for our GI. So I can also decrease the gamma here slightly and increase the gain. And for our subsurface scattering as well, I can increase this, but I think I will decrease this instead, so we can affect the grading of each individual channel. I might go to the GI grading, and I actually want to increase the gamma. And now we can grab our FireWall render, and I'll press M to add a merge node. And we will point the A layer here, or the B in this case, to our character render. I'll add another dot here, and I want to reverse this order, so I'll press Shift X. And if I look at the result, now we have the fire behind the character. And with this fire layer, I want to warp this fire to sort of wrap around our character. So from here I will do a grid warp. Let's add this here, and we will set the divisions to 3, or rather 4, I believe. And now we can grab these handles over here and shape our fire in the way that we want. So I will just drag this down, and I want this fire to sort of have a curvature to it. So I'll grab some of these nodes and bring them down, and I will also bring some of these up, and we can control the handles here for our points to control the way these points interpolate. So I will just drag this down, and we'll do something, like I mentioned, into more of a curved look. So if I preview the result with the character and I turn off this grid warp effect, we can see the difference, and I believe it looks a little bit better and it integrates better with our character. And now from here we can do a crop, so we don't have to render everything that's outside of our render region. And I will drop a grade node, and let's gain this down so we can make this darker. And I might also want to reduce the gamma, and we can see that when we reduce the gamma, we introduce maybe more red than what we want. So we can also do a saturation, and we can decrease the saturation a little bit. And I can do another grade node, for example, and I can go to the multiply, and we can increase only the green channel to bring back a little bit of our yellowish color. And we can go back and forth between our grading adjustments until we get something that we are happy with. So I might reduce this even further. And another thing that I can do is I can fade this out towards the top. So I can drop a ramp, and we can use this ramp as a mask inside another grading adjustment. So I can do a simple white to black ramp, and I can add another grade node and point the mask to this ramp. And now if I look at the result, I can gain this down, and we want the reverse effect, so we can select this invert option over here, and we can see that as I decrease the gain, we only affect this top portion of our fire. And I can also control our ramp, so I can expand this a little bit, and let's look at the result with our character. So I think this is fine for now. I will go ahead and let's grab all of these and place them more at the top, so we have more room to work with here. And I want to introduce more bright spots in this firewall render, so I can use a keyer node. Let's drop this here and point it to our fire, and with this key node, if I press A, we can see what parts we select from our fire. So I can increase this contrast if I drag these handles here closer together, and if I press A again and I do a pre-mult, we end up only with this part that we filter, so some of these brighter parts. And I can add another gray node here, and I can gain these up and maybe the gamma as well. And I can also go to the multiply here and maybe introduce more yellow, so the green channel. And now I can merge this on top of what we had, so I'll press M and I'll set this operation to plus. So we have this extra layer that bumps up the brightest spots in our fire. And let's look at this with our character. And now we can go back to our grade nodes and maybe we can play around with some of the settings here until we get something that looks slightly cooler. And finally I will do another grade node right at the end, and we can use this to control the overall look for this fire render. And I think something like this will be fine for now, because we can always come back later and adjust the settings here after we add the other layers as well. Finally, we want to add a blur here, so let's do a defocus, and I will just increase the defocus amount, so we only want to introduce some slight blur to this layer. Alright, so let's move forward from here and let's add the actual fire of the character. So we will need our main render, this one over here. We can do a poster stem node and let's link this to our render. So this is essentially like an object merge works in Houdini. It's simply a node that points to our render, so this will help us to organize our comp. And we can hide this wire connection by pressing Alt H. So now we will only see the wire when we have this node selected. So from this render, let's go ahead and grab one of these shuffle nodes. I'll press Ctrl C and let's paste this over here. And with this shuffle node, we want to bring in the emission. And we no longer need this alpha because we are simply going to add this on top of everything. So we can get rid of our alpha connection. And for this emission layer, we can start with a motion blur. So this will smooth out everything. And this will also get rid of a lot of the noise in our render, which is great. Let's maybe reduce the shutter time to 0.4, so it's not as strong. And we also want to increase the samples. So let's maybe try value of 8. And this render is pretty okay if I were to just simply merge this on top of what we have. We can see that this works nicely as it is. A couple of things that we can do here is, let's maybe just add another dot here. I can do a grade node and I want to gain this down just a bit, and what I can do is introduce some white spots in the areas that are brightest in this fire, so we have a bit more variation in the colors, and also it's going to sort of give it more of a feel that it has a hot core. So we can do the same thing that we did earlier with a keyer. So let's point this to our motion blur and we can do a pre-mult after this. And now I can grab this keyer and I can squeeze these values in until we get only the really brightest spots. And after the pre-mult, I will also do a gain, and I will gain this down and decrease the gamma as well. And now for this layer, let's do a saturation and let's almost get rid of the colors entirely. So I will grade this down. Let's just grade this down so it's completely black and white. And I think I also want to decrease the gain even more, and also the gamma. So now I can add this on top. I will do a merge, which I will set to plus. And if I turn this on and off, we can see the effect that this layer will have. So over here especially, it kind of feels like we have this hot core around the brightest spots of our fire. So this is how we will bring in this fire pass, so the emission. And I also have a special pass from our main render, which is going to be the Fresnel shader, and we will use this to drive certain effects on the character itself. So I will make some room in between the character and the fire. So I'll drag all of these nodes down below, and let's add another poster stem node and point to our main render. I'll press Alt H to hide the node, and from here let's grab another one of the shuffle nodes. So I will press Ctrl C and let's copy this over, point to our render, and here I will grab the Fresnel path, so this Fres layer, which is really just a Fresnel shader that I set up in Houdini and exported this as a custom AOV. And the first thing that I want to do with this layer is use it as a mask in a grade node to affect the whole render, so our fire and the character. I will drop another grade node here and I will point the mask to our Fresnel shader. And if I go to the result, I will set the mask to use RGBA red because we don't have an alpha on this Fresnel shader. So let's go back to our grade. And if I set this to invert and I increase the gamma, we can see that this will only affect the areas that are outside of these white regions. So we are essentially going to darken everything except for the silhouette of our character. And to further control this, I will add another grade node for our Fresnel shader, which again is our mask for this grade. And first let's set some settings for the main grade node over here. So I will just decrease the gain and let's make some more subtle changes here. And now with this other grade node to affect our mask, I can increase the gamma maybe a little bit, and we can see what this will do for us if I look at the mask directly. So I can further control this here, and then we can go to our grade node, and I just want to maybe decrease the gamma slightly. And we can see what this does for us if I turn this on and off. We maintain the brightness around the silhouette of our character, and we darken everything that's more in the center. And now that we have this mask as well, we can go back to our character AOVs, and for example I can go to the SSS and maybe I want to increase the gamma now, and for the GI as well, so we can further fine-tune our look. And also I believe this smoke in the back, now we have to go back to our grade and I can increase the gamma back. And also with our Fresnel shader we can add a couple of extra effects. So from this shuffle I will drop another grade and I will decrease the gamma for this, maybe increase the gain, and I will do another grade node which I can use to turn this into more of a fiery look. So I want to increase the red channel and I will decrease the blue, and let's further increase the red. And now if I merge this on top, our character will have this very strong and sharp outline. So let's set this to plus, and if I turn this on and off, we can see what this does for us. And I might want to introduce even more red so I can further control the grading. And also I can use this same layer to add some glow as well. So I will do a crop after our grade, and we will use the AP glow node, which is a free exponential glow node available on Wikipedia, so I will provide you with a link for this if you want to use it as well. And let's tweak the settings of this glow. So we want something fairly sharp, and maybe I will increase the persistence, so the spread, and I will add this on top as well, and let's set this to plus. So if I grab all of these layers that we created with this Fresnel pass and turn them off, we can really see a big difference here. And let's look at the result with the fire on top as well. Alright, so I believe this is starting to look pretty good. Of course we can add some glow based on the fire emission as well. So let's do another crop here, and let's also use the AP glow node. And for the settings here I will want a pretty large persistence, which is sort of the radius, and I will decrease the intensity maybe, and I can decrease the response to sharpen this a little bit. Let's add this on top and see what we get, and set the operation to plus. So now with this extra glow, it's all starting to come together, and I might want to increase the persistence even more, and maybe the intensity as well. So this will also be up to you and your own preferences, but I think this is looking fine for now. And from here we can bring our Embers layer as well. So here I have the Embers, and this will be a simple plus operation. So I will just drop down a merge, and we can set operation to plus. And let's add a grade node here, and I might want to decrease the gamma and maybe the gain a little bit. But we don't really have to spend a lot of time on this layer because I think this looks pretty good as it is. So now that we have all of our layers in the comp, we can do some overall post-processing effects, and the main one that I'm interested in is adding a heat wave effect, and we will need for this a distortion map and also a blur map, and we can base this map off of our FireWall render. So I will go over here to the top, I will do a poster stamp to point to this FireWall render, and I will grab this and drag this down and press Alt H to hide the node, so we can use this as our distortion and blur map. So for the distortion I will use XDistort, which is another node available on Nukepedia, and I'll point the source to our main chain, and the distortion map I will point to our FireWall render. And let's preview the result of this. Let's set the distortion from map, which will now look at our render, and now all we have to do is control our distort blur settings, and I will decrease the blur, and let's also decrease the distortion, and also I want to decrease the blur map value here, so we can see as I turn this effect on and off the effect that this will have. And probably this is a little bit too strong, so I will decrease the distortion amount even more, and I think something like this looks a little bit better. And now for our blur we will use an eye blur node, and again this will be available on Nukepedia, and this is looking for a mask, but our mask needs an alpha. So from our render we will do a shuffle, and we will shuffle the red channel in our alpha channel. So if I press A, we have this alpha channel, and I want to further control this, so I will do a grade which I can set to channels alpha, and now I can gain this down and I can increase the gamma, so I want this to be a little bit sharper, something like this. And I also want to stretch this out so it covers more space vertically, so I can do a transform from here. Let's drop this down after our grade, and I will just uncheck the uniform scale, so I will press this 2 over here, and I will just increase this, and I can also bring this down, or rather up further. So I just want to stretch this so it covers the whole screen, so we end up with something like this. And now essentially wherever we have white spots we will have blurring, so we will point this mask from the eye blur node to our transform, and let's look at the result. I'll press A to go back to our RGBA view, and if I increase the blur size we can see these areas now that will be blurred. So this in combination with our XDistort will create this nice heat wave effect, and it's also going to help blend everything better together. Finally, I also want to add some lens flare effects, and we can base this lens flare on our emission channel from our main render. So over here where we, let's grab our fire from here, so where we shuffle this out, let's do another poster stem node and bring this down below. So we'll point this here, I'll drag this down, press Alt H to hide the node, and I want to only select the brightest parts of this fire, so I will do a keyer with a pre-mult, and I will increase this contrast here to only bring out the brightest parts. Let's add the gray node as well and gain this down and maybe decrease the gamma. And I also want to blur this a little bit so it's a bit more smooth, so let's drop down a blur and increase the size slightly. And now I can use this render in a convolve node. So first I will need a filter shape, and I will create a simple radial for this. So I'll drop down a radial, and I just want to stretch this quite a bit, so I will hold down Control and drag the handle out until we get a nice horizontal strip like this. And also I will remove the clipping, so I will set this to no clip, and I will drop this into a convolve node, and let's point our, so this needs to be our filter. Let's go ahead and point the filter to our radial and the image to our render. So now it's essentially going to take all of these values here and it's going to stretch them out based on the radial shape. So the longer I make this line, or whatever shape I give this filter, the convolve is going to use that shape. And now I can go back to our gray node for the render, and if I decrease this, I can make this a little bit more subtle. And also maybe back to our keyer, I can gain this down, and maybe I want to increase the blur here a little bit. And this we can merge over our main render. So let's set this to plus, and this will be our lens effects. Of course, I can still go after this convolve and add a gray node, and I think this is too red, so I can go to the gain here and increase the green channel so we get a little bit more yellow, or I can just simply decrease the red, so something like this. And it's going to be a matter of fine-tuning all of the grade nodes to get a really good result here. And finally, no render is complete without adding some grain, so I will drop a grain node here, and we can try some of these presets here and see which of these looks best. And then we can fine-tune all of the values, and we don't want to overdo this effect, so I might want to reduce all of these channels. But obviously with the grain, all of our layers will blend a lot better together. And with this we have completed the entire comp, so I hope you found this section useful. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the course, because we don't really have a lot of layers, this was a pretty simple comp, especially compared to some of the other courses that I have. But even though we kept things simple, we can still see a big difference between the final result and the one that we start with. And I hope this encourages you to spend a little bit of extra time compositing your effects, because I can promise you that it's going to make you a better VFX artist. And with that being said, we have reached the end of this course, and I hope that you found it useful. Please let me know what you think, and hopefully we can see each other again in a new course.